5 seconds from now, the most powerful colonel on this frontier will lower his own weapon before a man he's called a deserter for 5.
You spent 5 years hunting a ghost, Colonel. Today, that ghost is standing right in front of you.
Rourke, I actually thought you died out there in that desert by now. Exactly the way you deserve to.
I thought the same about you. Guess we were both disappointed. 5 years I was questioned about my command. My judgment doubted again and again. My conscience mattered more than slaughtering people who never held a weapon in their hands. It always did. It always will.
That village was harboring armed rebels. Every report confirmed it. Report you wrote yourself, after it was all over, to bury what you actually did. There were no rebels in that village, Colonel T.
Sir, is that true? What he's saying?
That's not... You don't understand the pressures of command, Rourke. You never did. That's why you...
And the most powerful colonel on this frontier was finally forced to his knees. But that was not the highest price he would have to pay.
Arizona Territory. Summer, 1879. The wind did not forgive out here. It never had. That was the first thing the desert ever taught him. And the last lesson he expected to still be learning at 34. You forgave the desert nothing, and it returned the favor tenfold. And somewhere in between those two facts, a man either hardened into something that could survive out here, or he didn't survive at all. Silas Rourke had chosen the hardening, or it had chosen him. He'd stopped being sure which, years back, and had mostly stopped caring about the distinction. 5 years he'd been alone by choice, though choice was a generous word for it. 5 years of small fires built low against ridgelines where the light wouldn't carry. 5 years of sleeping with one ear tuned to hoofbeats that never quite came, though he never stopped listening for them, because the men who'd once ridden under him had long memories, and long memories in this country had a way of turning into short tempers with rifles attached. He didn't mind the solitude. That was the lie he told himself on the good days. On the bad ones, he minded it plenty, minded it the way a man minds a wound that never quite closes over. One he'd stopped bothering to bandage because bandaging implied he expected it to heal. Silas Rourke had learned that the hard way, the way most things get learned in this country. Not from a book, not from a preacher, from losing. He was 34 years old, and he moved like a man twice that. Slow through the ribs, careful with the left shoulder, a limp that only showed itself after the 10th mile, which was exactly when nobody was around to see it, because nobody was ever around. That was the arrangement. That was the whole arrangement of his life now, and he had made his peace with it, or told himself he had, which is not the same thing, which he knew, which he chose not to think about, most days, and today was supposed to be most days. Until it wasn't. He heard the horse before he saw her. A high broken sound, not quite a scream, caught somewhere between the rocks below the ridgeline. He knew that sound. Every scout knows that sound. It is the sound of an animal that has already decided it is going to die and is simply waiting for something to agree with it. He did not think. That was the first mistake, if you wanted to call it a mistake. He went down the slope at a half-run, boots sliding on shale, and found her wedged between two boulders in a dry wash. One foreleg twisted wrong, eyes white-rimmed with panic. A stray, somebody's lost mare. Didn't matter whose. Easy, he said. Just the one word. He didn't have more words in him most days, and the ones he did have, he spent on horses instead of people. Horses didn't ask questions. Horses didn't want explanations for a man who slept 40 yards from his own fire and kept his back to stone. He worked her leg free. Slow. Patient. The kind of patient that cost something. And that was when the rock gave. Not much. A foot of loose shale under his boot heel. Enough. He went down hard against granite, and something in his side tore open with a heat that had no right being called pain, because pain didn't cover it. Pain was a word for smaller things. He lay there a moment, sky spinning white above him, and thought, with a strange and distant calm, well, there it is then. Because that was how it went, wasn't it? A man spends 5 years dodging the death he thinks is chasing him old army rifles, old army grudges, and then a horse he doesn't even own does the job instead, on a rock nobody will ever find him under. There was something almost funny in that. He might have laughed, except laughing pulled at the tear in his side, and pulling at the tear in his side was a mistake he made exactly once. The mare, freed now, staggered upright a few feet off and stood there trembling, watching him with the flat, uncomprehending eyes of an animal that doesn't understand debt. He didn't blame her for that. Understanding debt wasn't a horse's job. He got his good hand under himself, pushed, failed, tried again. Because failing once didn't mean failing twice. Not if he had any say in it, and he intended to have some say in it for as long as his body would let him. The second try got him to his knees. The world tilted hard, and he pressed his forehead to the cool stone and waited for it to stop, which it eventually did, mostly, enough to call it stopped even if it wasn't really. He should have died that night. He knew it even as he was living through it, which is a peculiar thing to know. Fever came fast, too fast. By the time the sun dropped, he was seeing shapes in the rock that weren't there, his old captain, dead 8 years. A woman's face he hadn't let himself picture in longer than that. Water. He kept seeing water, which the desert does to a dying man, shows him exactly what he doesn't have. He crawled. That was all it was anymore. Crawling. Because standing had stopped being an option somewhere around midnight, and lying still meant the buzzards would start their patient circling by morning, and some stubborn animal part of him, the part that had kept him alive through worse than this, though just barely, and only just refused, would not. Not yet. So he crawled toward a break in the limestone he'd half seen in the moonlight, a crack no wider than a doorway, black-mouthed, cool air breathing out of it like the desert's own held breath. Finally let go. Water smell. Or he imagined it. Didn't matter which. He pulled himself through the gap on his elbows, rock tearing what was left of his shirt, and the last thing he registered before the dark took him whole was that the tunnel kept going. Down. Deeper than any cave had business going. Then nothing. Except it wasn't quite nothing. Fever doesn't grant a man true nothing, not even the mercy of that. It gives him fragments instead, and made him live inside them one at a time, with no order to any of it, and no way to climb back out. He was 9 years old, watching his father shoe a horse that didn't want shoeing, which became, without warning, the smell of gun smoke and something worse underneath it, a smell he'd spent 5 years trying to scrub out of the back of his throat, and had never once succeeded, until that dissolved too, into his own voice, younger, saying, "No, sir, I won't," to a man whose face he could no longer picture clearly, even in memory, though the shape of the refusal had never once gone soft. And then his mother's hands. And then nothing that made any sense at all. And then threaded through all of it, like a single clear note in a storm of noise. Water. Dripping. Real, he thought. That one felt real. He was wrong about very little in his life that he was prouder of being wrong about. Voices. Low. Female. Speaking fast in a language he didn't have, though something in the rhythm of it sharp, then softer, then sharp again, told him it was fear talking, whatever the words were. He didn't open his eyes. Didn't dare. Some old scout instinct, buried under the fever, telling him, stay still. Listen first. Living men who listen first live longer than living men who don't. A hand on his shoulder. Not gentle. Testing. Another voice closer, murmuring something that had a question mark hiding inside it, even in a language he couldn't read. Then hands. Several. Lifting. He drifted. The way you drift when your body has finally decided the fighting is somebody else's job for a while. He caught pieces. Torchlight flickering orange against stone that curved too smooth, too deliberate, to be natural rock alone. The smell of wood smoke and tanned hide and something green growing where nothing green should grow underground. A sound like, and this confused him even in his half-consciousness, children laughing. No, not children. Women. Dozens of them. More than dozens. their voices layered on top of each other in a way that made no sense for a cave in the middle of nowhere. He thought, I'm dead. This is what dead sounds like. Except dead didn't usually hurt this much in the ribs. Awareness came back to him in stages, the way morning comes back to a man who drank too much the night before. First, the smell herbs, bitter and green, pressed against a wound he did not remember having dressed. Then the sound of water, real water, dripping somewhere close, steady as a clock. Then the light, firelight, low and orange, and moving against stone walls that arched overhead like the inside of something built, not something found. He was on his back, something soft beneath him, a blanket over the worst of him, and someone was cutting his shirt away. He came up fast, too fast, the wound in his side, screaming its objection, and a hand pressed flat against his chest, hard, pinning him back down with more strength than the frame behind it looked like it should carry. Esté quieto. Spanish. Then switching, accented but sure still. You are still. He blinked the room into focus. A woman knelt over him. Younger than he'd guessed, from the voice 30, maybe. Dark eyes that had already decided several things about him, and weren't finished deciding more. Her hands were steady on the bandage she was working loose, and there was blood on them that wasn't hers. Behind her, more women, a dozen at least, crowded at the mouth of the chamber, watching him the way you'd watch a rattler that had wandered into camp. Some held knives, not raised, just held, just ready. Where his voice came out wrecked, a stranger's voice. Where am I? Nobody answered that, which was an answer of its own. The woman kneeling over him, Taki, though he wouldn't have her name for another hour, yet finished peeling back the last of the wrapping they'd already put on him while he was unconscious. Some poultice gone dark with blood, and reached for the shirt collar, still clinging to his shoulder. She meant to check the wound properly. That was all. A healer's habit, or a warrior's, checking what she'd bound in the dark by torchlight. In daylight, such as daylight, existed down here to see if it had been done right. She pulled the shirt open and stopped. Everything stopped. He watched her face do something he would remember for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. Watched the color leave it. Watched her eyes go from a healer's clinical focus to something else entirely something, between disbelief and the beginning of terror. Suhala. Her voice came out barely above a breath, then louder, cracking down the middle. Suhala. Another woman pushed through the gathered crowd, older, maybe near 40, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who had seen panic before and did not intend to catch it herself. She knelt at Taki's shoulder and looked where Taki was looking, at his chest, bare now. No mistaking it, no article of clothing left to hide behind, no darkness left to lie in. The healer's face did not change the way Taki's had. It went still, terribly still. You're a man. 3 words. Flat. Final. The kind of sentence that closes a door somewhere, and you hear it close even if you can't see the door. Silas said nothing. There was nothing in him fast enough to say. Behind Taki and the healer, the crowd at the chamber mouth had gone from watchful to something with teeth in it. A blade sang free of its sheath, then another the sound of it, sharp and sudden in the stone quiet, ringing off the walls like something alive. A voice barked a command in that same language he didn't have, and every knife in the room turned toward him at once. He was too weak to run, too weak to fight. He understood, with a clarity that fever sometimes grants a dying man right before the end, that he was going to die on this blanket, in this cave, killed by women whose names he would never learn, for the crime of being born the wrong thing. Wait, it was Taki who said it. Her hand up, flat, the same gesture she'd used to pin him to the ground a minute before, except now it was aimed at her own people. He cannot even stand, she said, still in that accented English, like she wanted him or somebody to understand exactly what she was buying with the words. Let Tulsa decide. Not us. Not here. Nobody lowered their knives. But nobody moved either. And in the space between those two facts, Silas Rourke understood he had just been given something he had not earned. A little more time. They did not kill him. Not yet. That distinction, the not yet, followed him through the next several hours, like a shadow, with its own weather. 2 women bound his wrists, not cruelly, but with the particular thoroughness of people who had done this before and intended to keep doing it right. A strip of cloth went over his eyes, and someone half carried, half dragged him down a passage he could not see, through air that grew cooler and stranger, the smell of stone and smoke, and he would swear it. Feverish as he was, the smell of bread baking, somewhere far off, in a place that had no business having an oven at all. He tried to build a map in his head out of turns and echoes. Old habit, scout's habit, left, then a long straight stretch, then downstairs, actual stair, cut into the rock, then the sound changed entirely, opened up, and he understood, even blindfolded, that he had passed from tunnel into something enormous. Voices everywhere. Dozens. Hundreds. He thought of every story he'd half heard in his years. Riding scout, the cavalry soldiers talk around a fire. The kind you didn't repeat to officers, because it sounded like liquor talking. Ghost women. A tribe of them, living underground, taking no prisoners because they took no men at all. He'd laughed at those stories once. He was not laughing now. They brought him to a stop. Hands pressed him down onto something, a bench, cool stone, and the blindfold came away. He was in a chamber he had no words built for. Torches ringed the walls in iron brackets, throwing long gold light up into a ceiling lost somewhere in shadow, 30, maybe 40 feet overhead. The walls themselves had been worked not roughly, not by accident, but shaped, smoothed, fitted in places with stone laid by hand. A council chamber. Somebody had built this. Somebody had built all of this, and around him, standing in a loose half-circle that was not loose at all, not really, not in the way it positioned itself, between him and every exit stood perhaps 20 women, warriors, by their bearing, weapons close at hand, if not drawn. At the center of them, seated on a low stone seat that had clearly been made for exactly this purpose for judgment, sat a woman of maybe 45, gray threading heavy, through black hair, pulled back severe from a face that had stopped being soft a long time before he ever crawled into her world. She studied him the way a woman studies debts she has to collect. "My name is Tulsa," she said. Her English was rougher than Taki's, chosen word by careful word, but there was nothing uncertain in the delivery. "You are in my house. You will answer, or you will not leave it breathing." "Fair enough," Silas said. His voice still wrecked, still a stranger's, but steadier now. "Ask. Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. I was hunting. Horse got hurt. I got hurt worse, pulling her loose." He nodded toward the healer, Suhala, who stood near Tulsa's shoulder with her arms folded, watching him with an expression he could not read and did not trust. "Found a crack in the rock. Crawled in. That's the whole of it." "That is not the whole of it," Tulsa said. "Because a man does not stumble into this place. This place does not want to be stumbled into." "Then I got lucky," Silas said. "Or unlucky. Depending which way you're about to go with this." A ripple went through the gathered women at that, not laughter, nothing close to laughter, but something that acknowledged the nerve of it. Tulsa's face did not move at all. "You wear cavalry boots," she said. "Cavalry belt. You carry yourself like a soldier who has not been a soldier in some time. And you understand Spanish, which means you understand more than most white men who wander this country understand." She leaned forward slightly. "Which army?" "Not anymore. Not for 5 years." "Why?" The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, and he felt the ripples of it go out through every part of him that he'd spent 5 years trying to keep locked down tight. He looked at his own bound hands instead of her face. "Because I stopped taking orders I couldn't live with," he said. "That's the whole of that, too." Tulsa held his eyes a long moment, then turned to Suhala, and something passed between the two women that had nothing to do with him at all. Old history, old argument, the kind two people carry between them like a second language. "He should already be dead," said a third voice, and Silas turned to find it. A woman near Tulsa's own age, though harder-edged, her hand resting on the hilt of a long knife like it belonged there the way a hand belongs on a Bible. "Every hour he breathes, he is a mouth that can tell where we are. To anyone. To everyone. We did not survive what we survived to gamble it on a stranger's silence. He's half dead as it stands. Nashota. Suhala said flat, practical, the voice of a woman doing arithmetic instead of feeling anything. Kill a corpse if you want a corpse. But before you do, he speaks English. He speaks Spanish. He rode cavalry, which means he reads their maps, knows their patrol routes, knows how they think when they're hunting something in this country. We have needed exactly that kind of knowledge for longer than I care to say aloud. She paused. I am not arguing for mercy. I am arguing for use. Use, Nashota repeated, like the word tasted wrong in her mouth. And when his use runs out, what then? You'll have taught a man our tunnels, our numbers, our weaknesses, and you think we simply release him back into the desert with our secrets in his mouth. I did not say release him. Then say what you mean. Silas sat very still through all of it, understanding, with the particular clarity of a man whose life is currently the subject, under discussion, that the smartest thing he could possibly do was say nothing at all and let 3 women argue out the terms of his continued existence without his help. It was Taki who spoke next, and when she did, the chamber went quieter to hear it. She was young to command that kind of quiet, and Silas noted it even through the fog of fever, marked her down in his mind the way he'd once marked which soldiers a captain actually listened to versus which ones he merely tolerated. He could have let the horse die, she said. Left it, ridden on. Instead, he tore his own side open, pulling it free of rock. She looked at Tulsa, not at him. I am not saying that makes him harmless. I am saying it tells us something. A man who spends his last strength on an animal that isn't his, that is not nothing. Sentiment, Nashota said, gets women killed in this country. You know that better than anyone at this fire, Taki. You, of all of us. Something crossed Taki's face at that quick, sharp, gone before Silas could name it, and he understood, without knowing why or how, that there was a wound in that sentence he was not being shown the shape of. Not yet. Tulsa raised one hand, and the chamber fell fully silent. The argument cut clean the way a knife cuts. We will not decide this tonight, in fever and blood, she said. He stays, bound, watched, in the stone room, with the iron door, where he can see nothing of what he does not need to see. Her eyes found Silas again, and there was nothing warm in them, nothing that could be mistaken for warmth. You will live as long as you are useful, and not 1 hour longer. Suhala tends your wound because a dead man tells us nothing. Taki and Suhala alone may speak with you. No one else. You will not learn names. You will not learn faces beyond what you have already seen, and you will pray to whatever god a man like you prays to, that what you have already seen does not become a reason to end this quickly. Understood, Silas said, because it was the only word available to him, and because some part of him, the old scout part, the part that had survived worse rooms than this one, recognized a good outcome when it was handed to him bound and blindfolded. Tulsa stood. The council chamber stood with her, a single motion like water responding to wind. One more thing, she said, and for the first time, something almost like curiosity moved behind the flat authority of her voice. You never told us your name. He thought about lying, thought about it seriously, for exactly as long as it took to draw one breath. Silas Rourke. Tulsa held that name in her mouth a moment, tasting it, weighing it the way she seemed to weigh everything. Then, Silas Rourke, she said, you will learn what it costs to be the only man alive who knows this place exists. She turned to go, and might have left it there, might have let the threat stand alone, unexplained, the way threats usually did, but something made her stop at the chamber's edge, half in shadow, half in torchlight, and look back at him one final time. You wonder why the law is what it is, she said. Not a question, though he hadn't asked. Why no man ever, whatever his wound, whatever his story. I will tell you once, so you understand exactly what you are standing inside of, and exactly how little patience it has left for men who promise better. The chamber had gone still again, that particular stillness that meant every woman in it already knew this story, and was bracing to hear it anyway, the way you brace for a wound, reopening, even when you know the reopening is necessary. 12 years ago there was another place, not this one. Farther south, smaller, newer. We had not learned yet what we know now. Tulsa's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. There was a man among us then, wounded as you are wounded, found half dead as you were found. We nursed him as Suhala has nursed you, and some of us came to trust him, as fools trust anything that speaks softly enough for long enough. A pause, and something moved behind her eyes that was not quite grief and not quite fury, but shared a border with both. He left in the night, once he was strong enough to walk. 3 days later, soldiers came. They knew exactly where to dig, exactly which passage was weakest, exactly how many of us there were, and exactly when we would be sleeping. Silas felt the floor of his own chest drop away. How many, he asked. Though some part of him already understood, he did not want the number. More than I will say aloud to a stranger, Tulsa said. Enough that the law was written the same week, in blood still wet on the stone, and has not been broken since. Enough that every woman standing in this chamber tonight either lived through it herself or was raised on the memory of it the way other children are raised on Scripture. Her eyes held his, unblinking. So when I tell you that you live only as long as you are useful, understand that I am not being cruel to you, Silas Rourke. I am being merciful. The law as it was first written did not permit even that much. She left him with that, and the chamber emptied around him in near silence, women filing out one by one without a backward glance, until only the guard remained to walk him back through the dark to his stone room with its iron door. He lay on the stone shelf a long while that first night, staring at nothing, turning the story over the way a man turns over, a stone looking for what's crawling underneath it, a community built entirely on the memory of one betrayal. Every kindness they'd shown him since the bandage, the water jug that never ran dry, even the argument that had kept the knives sheathed, every bit of it had been extended in spite of that memory, not because they'd forgotten it. That was a harder thing to earn than simple trust. Trust could be given cheap, by people who'd never been burned. This was something else. This was people who knew exactly what fire felt like, choosing, against every instinct honed by that fire, not to strike the match yet. He did not sleep well. He did not expect to, not for a long time yet to come, because his mind wouldn't quit turning the story over. 12 years. A man who ate their food, slept in their warmth, walked out into the dark like gratitude, was a debt he'd never actually meant to pay, which made him wonder, lying there, whether that was all he looked like to them too. Another mouth waiting for its chance. Another back turned the moment the door opened, until he caught himself wondering it and made himself stop, because wondering it too hard was its own kind of guilt, guilt for a crime he hadn't committed yet and maybe never would, and a man could talk himself into anything lying alone in the dark long enough. Guilt included, especially guilt, except the thought kept circling back anyway. 12 years, and the law still standing, wet ink over an old wound that had never fully scarred, and him lying in the middle of it, bound, watched, breathing on borrowed time that Tulsa herself had told him, plainly was borrowed. So he did the only thing that had ever worked for him in situations like this one, which wasn't much of anything, which was simply outlasting the night, one slow breath at a time, until the dark thinned enough at the edges to call it morning. It thinned, eventually. It always did. That much, at least, the desert had never lied to him about. They kept their word. Mostly stone, mostly dark, mostly silence. That was the shape of the days that followed, measured out in the drip of water from somewhere he couldn't see, and the changing of a guard whose face he never learned, because she always came in shadow and left the same way. The chamber was small. Iron door, real iron, which told him more about this place than anything. Tulsa had said aloud a community that could forge iron underground had resources, and patience, and time, more of both than any drifting cavalry deserter had any business underestimating. A stone shelf for a bed, a water jug that never quite ran dry, refilled by hands he didn't see while he slept, or pretended to. Nashota came on the third day, alone, no lamp in her hand, no bandages, nothing that pretended this was a healer's visit. She stood over him with her arms crossed and studied him the way a woman studies a fence she's already decided needs tearing down, just hasn't found the right hour yet. "You're still breathing," she said. "Seems that way. Don't get comfortable with it. Wasn't planning to. Good. She crouched, finally, close enough that he could see the old scar tracing her jaw, pale against darker skin, and he found himself wondering what story lived behind it and knowing better than to ask. Because I want you to understand something, Rourke. Tulsa decides. Taki argues pretty. Suhala calculates. But if it were only me in that chamber, you'd already be dead. And some nights I still think that would have been the simpler outcome for everyone. Maybe, Silas said. Simple's not always the same as right, though. Don't lecture me on right. Her voice went sharp, quick, a blade drawn half an inch and returned. You don't know what right cost us to learn? No, he agreed. I don't. Wasn't trying to say I did. Then what were you trying to say? Nothing much. Just that I've met plenty of simple men in my life who slept easy at night. Doesn't mean they were the ones worth trusting. Nashota studied him a long beat, something working behind her eyes that he couldn't name. You talk like a man who thinks talking will save him. I talk like a man who's got nothing left but talking. Bound hands don't leave a lot of other options. Careful, she said. That's almost funny. And I don't like men who are funny. Funny men talk their way into rooms they don't belong in. I didn't talk my way in here, Silas said. Crawled. Half dead. Wasn't exactly angling for an invitation, which is the only reason you're still alive to argue with me about it. She stood, looking down at him now, and the argument seemed to drain out of her all at once, replaced by something flatter and colder and, he thought, older than the argument itself. I lost a sister the year Tulsa told you about. 12 years old. Younger than half the girls training in the ring above your head right now. I don't forgive easy, Rourke, and I don't forget at all. So don't mistake my silence in that council chamber for permission. It was patience. And patience runs out. She left without waiting for an answer, which was just as well, because he didn't have one that would have satisfied either of them. Suhala came each day to check the wound. She worked in near silence, professional, unbothered by his presence, in a way that told him she'd made her decision about him already, and simply hadn't announced it to the room. Once, unwrapping the bandage, she said without looking up, "You are healing faster than you should, for a man who was half a corpse a week ago." Stubborn, Silas said, or lucky. Never could tell which. Luck runs out, Suhala said. Stubborn doesn't. She tied off the fresh wrap, sat back on her heels, and studied him with an expression that had shifted, subtly, from the flat calculation of that first night. Why did you really leave the army, Rourke? He'd been waiting for the question, dreading it. The way you dread a door you know you'll eventually have to open. There was a village, he said. Slow. The words coming up out of some deep place he kept sealed most days. Sealed the way you seal a well that's gone bad. Not a war camp. Not even armed, most of it. Old men. Women. Some children too young to run. He stopped. Made himself keep going, because stopping halfway through a wound like this one only left it open longer. My captain had orders. I told him I wouldn't ride point on it. Told the men under me the same. Some listened. Most didn't. And the village. Burned anyway. Without me. His jaw worked once, hard. Which didn't make it better. Made it worse. Some days. Man walks away clean, and the thing he walked away from happens regardless. There's no clean in that. There's just a man who didn't have to watch. Suhala was quiet a long moment. They called you deserter. Called me worse than that, some of them. Hunted me some too, first year or so. Gave that up eventually. Figured I'd die out here on my own without their help. He almost smiled, and it came out crooked, more scar than expression. Almost did. You people just got to me first. Suhala studied him with new weight behind her eyes, and when she rose to leave, she paused at the iron door, hand on the cold metal. There are women in this place, she said, who lost everything to men wearing that same uniform. Every one of them will hear your story as an excuse. Some of them are right not to trust an excuse, however true it sounds. She looked back at him. But I have tended enough wounds in my life, Rourke, to know the difference between a lie that heals clean and a truth that doesn't. Yours doesn't heal clean. That tells me something. She left him with that, and the iron door closed behind her with a sound like a held breath finally let out. 10 days in, Suhala decided he was fit enough to stand without the wall's help, and fit enough, therefore, to be walked. Walked, Silas repeated when she told him. Like a horse. Like a man whose legs I need to know still work, Suhala said, before I waste any more of my herbs, keeping the rest of him alive. She nodded to the guard. At the door, a broad-shouldered woman named Cheppy, who never spoke to him and never needed to. Her silence, its own kind of eloquence, and the iron door swung open onto the passage beyond. They did not blindfold him this time. He noticed that. Filed it away, the way he filed everything. The passage opened, after some minutes of careful walking, into a space that stole the breath clean out of him, wound or no wound. A cavern. Vast beyond anything he'd pictured, lying in the dark, trying to build it from sound alone. The ceiling vanished upward into shadow so deep the torchlight never found its edges. Stone shelves and ledges had been carved and fitted along the walls, level upon level, and on those ledges he could make out the shapes of a whole world going about its business. Women grinding grain at stone querns. Women stitching hide by lamplight. An old woman, the first true elder he'd seen, teaching something to a cluster of younger ones, gathered cross-legged at her feet. A channel of water ran through the yetchern floor, diverted and controlled, feeding what looked like troughs and basins along its length. Somewhere off to his left, out of sight, he could hear the ring of the forge he'd only imagined before, real now, alive. Hammer on hot iron in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. He stopped walking. Couldn't help it. Something wrong, Suhala said, watching him with something close to amusement. No, Silas managed. Just, I've scouted for the army 8 years. Crossed this territory more times than I can count. Never once heard whisper of anything like this. Not real whisper. Just campfire, talk nobody believed. That was the intention, Suhala said. Belief is the enemy of a place like this. The moment men believe we exist, they start looking properly. Rumor keeps us safer than any wall could. How many, he asked, before he could stop himself, living here? Suhala's eyes cut to him, sharp, and for a moment he thought he'd overstepped badly enough to end the walk early. More than you could count from one cavern, she said finally, which is all the answer you are owed today. They moved on, and every woman they passed found some reason to look at him quick, sidelong unhidden, and he understood he was being catalogued as thoroughly as he was cataloging them. No, not a boy, a girl of maybe 14, the youngest he'd seen down here, paused in her grinding to stare at him outright until an older woman at her shoulder murmured something that sent her back to work, cheeks coloring. They've never seen a man, Silas said. Understanding arriving slow, the way understanding does when a man spent his whole life on the other side of a question and never had to think about it from this angle. Some have, Suhala said, before they came here. Most were young enough when they arrived that the memory doesn't hold much shape anymore. To the youngest, you are less a man and more a rumor-grown legs, and walked into their home. She glanced at him. Try not to enjoy that as much as I can see you wanting to. Wasn't planning to enjoy any of it, Silas said, though there was something almost like a smile fighting its way up through the ache in his side. Just wasn't expecting to feel more like a curiosity than a threat. Give it time, Suhala said not unkindly. You are both. Which one wins out depends entirely on you, Rourke, and very little on anything I could tell them in your favor. They walked the cavern's edge a while longer, Suhala naming nothing, explaining little, but letting him look his fill, and Silas understood, without being told outright, that this too was a kind of test whether a man shown the whole shape of a hidden world would think first of escape and rumor and reward, or whether he'd simply stand there the way he was standing now, quietly humbled by the scale of what stubborn, wounded, unwitnessed people could build when the world had given them every reason to build nothing at all. It was Taki who came the following night, and she came differently than Suhala did, not with bandages, but with a small clay lamp and a look on her face like a woman who had argued with herself the whole walk down and lost. She set the lamp on the stone shelf and sat across from him, close enough to speak low, far enough to keep a blade's reach of distance between them out of old habit, rather than fresh fear. You want to know I spoke for you, she said. Not a question. She'd clearly decided to say it before he could ask. I wondered, Silas admitted. Man, in my position, wonders about the person who kept the knives off him. Feels owed, some. Feels wary. Two. Hard to know which is louder. Wary, Taki said. Keep it that way. It will serve you better than gratitude down here. But something in her voice didn't match the warning. Something almost like she wished the warning weren't necessary. She was quiet a moment, turning something over. Then 5 years ago, she said, cavalry rode through the country south of here. Struck a camp at dawn. My camp. Her voice did not shake. It had the flatness of something spoken so many times inside her own head that the outside version had worn smooth like river stone. I was 25. I ran. Others did not run fast enough. Silas felt something go cold, and still inside his chest. Which unit? I do not know unit numbers, Taki said. I know it was cavalry. I know the sun was barely up. I know the sound horses make when they are being run through people instead of grass, and I have never forgotten it, and I never will. Her eyes came up to his, steady, unflinching, and there was something in them that was not quite accusation, and not quite anything else, either something suspended, waiting to fall one way or the other. You said you refused an order once. You said a village burned anyway. I have wondered, since Suhala told me what you told her, whether it was the same fire. The silence that followed had weight to it, real weight, the kind that presses on a chest. I don't know, Silas said finally, and it cost him more than any lie would have. I truly don't. There were more villages struck that year than I like to count, and I wasn't present at all of them. And I've spent 5 years trying not to do the arithmetic on how many I might have been close enough to stop and didn't reach in time. He held her gaze, because looking away now would have been its own kind of lie. If it was mine, if my unit rode through your camp that morning, I won't insult you by saying, I'm sorry, it doesn't reach that far. I'll just say I've been trying to be a different kind of man ever since. And most days, I don't know if trying counts for anything at all. Taki studied him for a long, long moment, the lamp flame throwing small gold shadows across the stone between them. How old were you? Taki asked, before he could speak again, when you refused the order. 29. Old enough to know exactly what it would cost you. Old enough. Yes. Did it frighten you? Terrified me, Silas said. No hesitation in it. Man doesn't refuse an officer in that army without understanding what it might cost him. I understood. Did it anyway. Why? Because the alternative frightened me worse. Taki turned that over in silence, her eyes not leaving his. That is not an answer, she said. That is a dodge dressed as an answer. Maybe, Silas admitted. Truth is, I've turned that morning over 10,000 times since, trying to find the version of it that makes me the hero of my own story. Never found it. Closest I ever got is this. I looked at what they were fixing to do. Looked at the men fixing to do it, men I'd eaten with, slept beside, trusted with my own back in worse country than that camp. And I understood that whatever I became after that morning, I couldn't become it standing next to them. So I stepped back, told the ones under me they could step back too. Did they? Some. Most didn't. Most don't, Taki said quiet. That is the whole trouble with most, isn't it? I don't know either, she said finally, after a silence that had gone on long enough to become its own kind of answer. Whether it counts. She stood, gathering the lamp, but I find that I want it to, which frightens me more than you do, Silas Rourke. And that is the truth, whether either of us is glad to hear it. She left him alone, with the dark and the drip of water, and a question that had no bottom to it, one he suspected he would be falling through for a long time yet to come. The days blurred, one stone-quiet hour into the next, and he learned the rhythm of the place the way a man learns anything when he has nothing else to do but listen. Footsteps overhead at certain hours. Many, moving together, purposeful, and he guessed, correctly as it turned out, that this was training, drilling, a community keeping its edge sharp against a world that had already shown it exactly what happened to the dull. He counted the hoofbeats. That weren't hoofbeats, the rhythm of boots against packed earth, and built a rough picture in his mind of a training ring somewhere above him, larger than he'd have guessed a cave system could hold. Other sounds, too. A forge, ringing faint and far off, iron on iron, and he thought of the door on his own cell and understood, with a scout's grim appreciation, exactly where that iron had come from, and exactly how much labor a community had to organize to produce it underground. Out of nothing, out of stubbornness alone. Water moving, somewhere in channels cut through rock, feeding what he guessed must be storage cisterns, because no community this size survived on a single, dripping spring. Not for years, not for the 12 since Tulsa's story, and likely longer before that. Someone here understood engineering. Someone here had built a world. And laughter, distant. At certain hours, no. He corrected himself again. Not children. He'd asked Suhaswala once and she'd gone quiet in a way that told him the answer. Before she gave it, there are no children here, Rourke. And you will not ask me why again. Women's voices pitched high, in something like play. And he wondered what kind of world these women had built down here that still had room in it for a sound like that. Room for laughter, carved out of the same stone that held the memory of a betrayal 12 years old and still bleeding. He asked Suhala about it once, during a wound. Check. Careful with the question the way he'd learned to be careful with all his questions down here. How does a place like this hold both, he said. The grief and the laughing. Seems like they'd crowd each other out. Suhala considered that longer than the question seemed to warrant. You are thinking of grief wrong, she said finally. You are thinking of it as a room a person lives in. It is not a room. It is weather. It passes through, and it comes back, and in between it, life is still owed its due. She tied off his bandage with brisk, sure hands. We did not survive to sit in mourning forever, Rourke. We survived to live. The two are not opposites, whatever the men who hunted us might have assumed. He thought about that longer than he let on. It was around the same stretch of days that he first heard the name Kessa, spoken not to him, but near him, through the iron door. Two guards changing shift, in low voices they didn't trouble to lower far enough. Still won't sit at council since the vote. Sits alone at the third fire. Her and that niece of hers, like the rest of us, did something to her instead of the other way round. Tulsa should have exiled her outright instead of just stripping her voice from the circle. A woman who argues for opening trade with outsiders is a woman who will open a door herself, eventually, whether the council agrees or not. Ituha still visits her. Tulsa's letting that go, for now. Blood's blood, even here. The voices moved off before he heard more, but he tucked it away the way he tucked away everything down here now. A scout's old habit, refusing to die just because the war had. A woman cast out of the circle, but not out of the tunnels. A niece who still visited her, against what sounded like the current of the whole community's disapproval. He did not yet understand the shape of the trouble that name would come to mean for him. Only that trouble had a name now, and the name was Kessa, and somewhere above him she sat alone at a fire that had gone cold in every way but the literal one. Itua came the following night, uninvited, slipping past whoever meant to be guarding the door with the particular ease of someone young enough to still believe rules were suggestions. She was younger than Taki, 26. He'd learn later, though she carried herself both older and younger than that in the same breath, older in the set of her jaw, younger in the frank, unguarded curiosity with which she studied him like he was some new species of animal she hadn't catalogued yet. You're not what I expected, she said, by way of greeting, crouching just outside his reach with the wariness of someone who'd been told exactly how far his reach was and intended to respect it. Nashota says men are all appetite and no restraint. Tulsa says you're a liability breathing. Suhala says you might be useful. She tilted her head. What do you say you are? Tired, Silas said honestly. And bound. Not much room for appetite in either one. Something that might have been a laugh escaped her before she caught it, pressed her lips shut like she'd been told not to find him funny and had briefly forgotten the instruction. Kessa says the outside world is changing faster than we know, Ituha said, and there was something careful in the way she said the name, something that didn't match the casual tone she was reaching for. Says we can't stay hidden forever. Says a man who knows the cavalry's habits might be the difference between staying hidden and not. She studied him. Do you think that's true? That you're that useful? I think, Silas said slowly, that I don't yet know what I've walked into. But I know cavalry patrol patterns better than most men living. If that's worth something to your people, I'd rather earn my keep than sit here being argued about. You said the name Kessa, Silas said, before he'd fully decided to say it. Heard it once before through the door. Guards talking. Ituha's easy manner shuddered, quick, like a window closing against weather. You should forget you heard it. Can't forget what I don't understand in the first place. That's the idea. Ituha, don't, sharp now. You don't get to say my name like you've earned the right to ask me things. Fair, Silas allowed. Didn't mean it as familiar. Meant it as I've got nothing but hours down here, and hours spent wondering about a name I'm not allowed to ask about are hours I'll spend wondering anyway, whether you tell me or not. Might as well be accurate in my wondering. That won something close to a laugh out of her, quick and unwilling. She's my aunt, Ituha said finally, low, glancing once at the door like the walls themselves might carry it back to someone. Kessa. She sat in council once. Argued we should be trading with outsiders. Careful trading, distant trading, enough to get better rifles than the ones we've got. Council. Voted against her. Voted hard against her. She hasn't sat at the fire since. Voted her out. Voted her silent. Not the same thing, though most days it feels like it. Ituha's jaw tightened. She's not wrong, Rourke. About the rifles. We're fighting this country with weapons 20 years behind what rides against us. But being right and being trusted aren't the same coin down here. Not since she stopped herself, hard, like she'd nearly spent a coin she didn't have permission to spend. Since the man 12 years back, Silas finished for her, quiet. Ituha's eyes came up to his, surprised, then wary, then something that settled somewhere between the two. Tulsa told you that. Tulsa told me that. Then you understand why nobody trusts a good argument anymore. Not when the last good argument anybody made for trusting an outsider ended with half of us dead in our sleep. She shook her head. Kessa just wants us stronger. I believe that. But belief doesn't vote in council, and council doesn't forgive easy. And I'm caught in between, loving my aunt and understanding exactly why the others won't hear her out. Silas said nothing to that. There wasn't a version of comfort that belonged in his mouth, not on this particular subject, not from him. Ituha nodded, filing something away behind eyes that missed very little, and rose to leave before whoever she'd slipped past came looking. I don't think you're a liability, she said at the door. I think you're a question nobody's decided how to answer yet. A small, unreadable smile. Those are the most dangerous kind, where I come from, and the most interesting. She was gone before he could answer that, leaving him with the lamp shadows and the drip of water and the growing, uneasy understanding that he had not simply stumbled into a hiding place. It was 2 nights later that Nashota came for him in earnest, and this time she did not come to talk. He woke to the iron door, easing open, without the usual scrape of the bar being lifted properly, which told him before his eyes had even adjusted that whoever was coming through it wasn't supposed to be a shape in the dark. A blade catching the last dying light of the lamp Cheppy had left burning low outside. Don't, he said low, not moving. Every old instinct from 8 years of scouting screaming at him to stay still, stay small. Don't give a nervous hand with a knife any reason to close the distance faster than it meant to. Whatever this is, don't. I'm not here to talk you out of it, Nashota said, and her voice had none of the sharp, testing edge it carried in daylight. It had gone somewhere flatter, somewhere further down. I've talked myself in circles for 2 nights straight, Rourke, and every circle ends the same place. You're a risk this family can't afford, and Tulsa's too soft on you, and Taki's got some notion in her head about you that's going to get somebody killed one day, and I am tired, her voice caught, just slightly, just enough for him to hear the 12-year-old wound underneath the words, I am tired of being the only one still counting the cost properly. Then count it, Silas said, still not moving, keeping his voice level, keeping it slow, The way you'd talk down a spooked animal, because that was near enough to what this was. Out loud. Right now. Tell me what you're counting, Nashoda. Before you do something Tulsa didn't order, and this whole place has to live with after. I don't need her order. No, Silas agreed. You don't. Which means whatever happens next is yours alone to carry. Not hers. Not the council's. Yours. He held very still. The knife close enough now that he could feel the draft of it if she moved. You said you lost a sister. 12 years old. I believe you. I believe every word of what this place has survived. But you kill me in the dark, outside any order. Outside any council vote, you're not avenging her. You're just proving Tulsa's law was never really about protecting anybody. It was about you getting to decide, alone, in the dark, who lives and who doesn't. That's not justice, Nashoda. That's just grief with a blade in its hand. The silence that followed stretched long enough that he thought, quite calmly, that he might actually be about to die on this stone shelf, after everything, the fever, the crawl, the council, all of it ending here, in the dark, on nobody's order but one grieving woman's own. Then the knife lowered. Slow, reluctant but lowered. You talk like a man trying to save his own skin, Nashoda said, voice rough now, unsteady in a way he suspected she hated more than she'd ever admit. I am a man trying to save my own skin, Silas said. Doesn't make what I said untrue. She stood there a long moment more, breathing hard in the dark, and then, without another word, she turned and left, the iron door easing shut behind her with none of its usual finality, just a soft, uncertain sound, like a decision that hadn't fully been made yet. Silas lay awake the rest of that night, with his heart going hard against his ribs, and understood with total clarity that Tulsa's law was not the only thing standing between him and a knife in the dark down here. There was also this, whatever this was. Whatever thin, fraying thread of restraint Nashoda had found in herself at the last second, for reasons he suspected even she couldn't fully name. He did not tell Suhala about it the next morning. Did not tell Taki either. Some debts, he decided. A man paid forward by simply staying alive to earn the trust that might keep them from coming due again. He had stumbled into the middle of a fight this place had been having with itself long before he ever crawled through that crack in the limestone, a fight about fear and trust, about what a community owed its wounds, and what it owed the possibility of something better than wounds. And whether he lived past the week Tulsa had allotted him depended on which side of that old, unfinished argument finally won. Somewhere above him, faint through solid stone, he heard what he thought might be 100 voices, or more, raised together in something between a song and a warning. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, Silas Rourke found himself actually hoping, the way a man hopes when he still has something left to lose, that he would live long enough to learn the words. He thought of Tulsa's story before sleep finally took him, of a man who had eaten their food and slept in their warmth and walked out into the night to sell all of it for whatever price soldiers had offered him. He understood, lying there in the dark, exactly what kind of debt he had been born, owing the moment he crawled through that crack in the limestone. Not a debt of his own making, a debt some other man had made, 12 years and 100 miles removed from him, and left behind like a stone in the road for the next man to trip on. He did not know yet how he would pay it, only that he intended to try, because the alternative becoming, in these women's eyes, simply one more version of the same old wound was a thing he found, somewhere in the raw and healing dark of that stone room, he could no longer live with. Above him, faint through solid rock, the 100 voices rose again into their evening song, wordless to him still, but less frightening now than they'd been the first night, less like a threat, more like a world going on with its life, indifferent to whether he understood the words or not, and asking nothing of him except that he survive long enough, and prove himself worthy enough to someday learn them. He fell asleep to that sound, and for the first time since the fever broke, he did not dream of fire. Tulsa came herself 3 weeks in, and the moment he saw her fill the doorway, alone, no guard at her shoulder, no counsel trailing behind Silas, understood that whatever was about to happen, it had been decided already, somewhere above him, in some chamber he hadn't been invited back into. "Walk with me," she said. Not a request. They went a way he hadn't been shown before, up a narrow stair cut crude into the rock, until the air changed, thinned, carried a trace of something he hadn't smelled in weeks. Open sky. A shaft, he realized, looking up a natural chimney in the stone, screened by brush and rock from anyone passing above, letting in a single narrow column of true daylight that fell across the passage floor like something holy. He stood in it without meaning to, just stood there, face turned up, eyes closed, and did not care one bit how it looked to the woman watching him do it. 3 weeks, Tulsa said, when he finally opened his eyes again. And that is the first sunlight you have felt. Man doesn't know how much he misses a thing, Silas said, till it's given back to him a little at a time. Remember that, Tulsa said, the next time you consider whether staying alive down here is a mercy or a punishment. Some days it will feel like both. That is not a contradiction. That is simply the truth of it. She turned to face him, fully then, and for the first time since the council chamber, he saw something in her expression that wasn't pure judgment, something closer to a woman doing arithmetic she didn't enjoy but couldn't avoid. "The council has argued 3 weeks over what to do with you," she said. "Nashota still wants you dead. Suhala wants you useful. Taki a pause. Brief. Deliberate Taki wants something she has not fully named even to herself, and I will not name it for her. I have listened to all of it, and I have made my decision, and I am telling you now, so that you understand exactly what you are agreeing to. Because a man who does not understand the terms of his own survival is a man who will break them without meaning to. I'm listening. You will be permitted beyond the stone room. Under watch always. You will be given work suited to what you know, cavalry patrol patterns, army thinking, the shape of how soldiers hunt in this country, and you will give it honestly, or you will not be given the chance to give it a second time." Her eyes held his, unblinking, the same weight in them he'd felt the first night, undiminished by 3 weeks passing. "You will not be trusted. Do not mistake permission for trust. They are not the same coin, whatever Taki's softness might tempt you to believe. Trust is earned in years, Rourke, not in weeks, and this family does not hand it out early, no matter how good a story a man tells about the morning he grew a conscience." "Understood," Silas said again, the same word he'd given her the first night, except it landed different now, heavier, because now he understood exactly what he was accepting the weight of. "One more thing." Tulsa's voice dropped, just slightly, into something almost private. 12 years ago, the man who betrayed us was given exactly this same speech, almost word for word. I have wondered, every day since, whether the fault was in the speech, or in the man, or simply in the fact that trust offered even carefully, even with every safeguard a frightened people could build around it, is always in the end a gamble. She studied him a long moment. "I am gambling again. I want you to know that I know it. And I want you to understand that if you make me lose, I will not simply add another law to the wall. I will lead the blade myself. Then I'll do my level best," Silas said, "to make sure you never have to find out whether you meant that." Something that was almost, the ghost of approval, crossed Tulsa's face before she buried it back down under the authority she wore like armor. "See that you do," she said, and led him back down into the dark, toward whatever came next. That night, alone again in the stone room, though the iron door, he noticed, had been left unbarred for the first time. A small mercy that felt larger than it should have. Silas lay staring up at rock he could no longer see, and took stock of himself the way a man takes stock after a battle he wasn't sure he'd survive. He was alive. That was the plain fact sitting at the bottom of everything else. Alive. In a world he hadn't known existed a month ago, owing a debt he hadn't personally incurred to people who had every reason in the world to hate the sight of him, and had chosen, so far, narrowly, carefully, not to. He thought of Tulsa's law, written in blood 12 years old, of Nashota's knife, lowered in the dark but not put away for good, of Taki's question, that first night, whether it was his unit, his morning, his fire, a question neither of them had an answer to, and might never have one. Of Ituha, caught between an ant cast out of the circle and a community that couldn't afford to listen to her anymore. Of Suhala's flat, practical kindness, offered like currency she trusted more than sentiment. A month ago he had been a man alone by choice, sleeping 40 yards from his own fire, certain the rest of his life would look exactly like the last 5 years of it. Small, silent, unwitnessed. He understood now, lying in the dark with the door, unbarred for the first time, that whatever came next would not be small, would not be silent, and would very likely cost him more than the 5 years before it ever had. He found, turning that thought over one last time before sleep finally claimed him, that he was not sorry. Not yet. Not for any of it. Which frightened him a little, and which, he suspected, was exactly the point. The unbarred door did not stay a small mercy for long, because within a week it had become a door he walked through, every morning, under watch, yes, always under watch, but walking nonetheless, which was more than he'd let himself hope for, lying feverish on that stone shelf a month before. They gave him work, not trust. Tulsa had been plain about that distinction, and she meant to hold him to it. Work, though. Real work, which suited him better than trust would have, most days, because work was a thing a man could prove with his hands instead of his mouth. And Silas Rourke had never once in his life talked his way into anything worth keeping. Some mornings he woke before Cheppy came to collect him, and lay a while in the gray half-light, listening to the mountain stir awake around him, footsteps overhead, the far ring of the forge starting its day, water moving through channels he'd learned by now to name from sound alone, and thought, with a kind of disbelief that hadn't yet worn thin, that a month ago none of this had existed for him. Not the sounds, not the names, not the particular ache of wanting, badly, to be trusted by people who had every reason not to. He did not examine that wanting too closely most mornings. Some things a man left alone, the way you left a hornet's nest alone, not because you didn't know it was there, but because disturbing it accomplished nothing except get fix dung. They started him small. A map, unrolled across a stone table, in a side chamber he hadn't seen before, drawn crude by hands that had clearly never been taught proper surveying, but had gotten the bones of the country right anyway, ridge for ridge, wash for wash. Cheppy stood at the door the whole while, arms folded, watching him the way you'd watch a man handling something sharp. Where would cavalry water their horses? Suhala asked, coming through this stretch of country in summer. Silas studied the map a long moment, traced a finger along a dry wash that wasn't dry every season. Here, he said, and here. Army doesn't gamble with water. Officers get flogged in every report that follows a dry column, so they map the springs first and the route second. Any patrol working this stretch is going to cut through these 2 points, regardless of where their orders actually send them. Suhala said nothing, but she wrote it down, careful, in a hand that had clearly learned its letters late in life and took pride in every stroke anyway. And Silas understood that this, his knowledge, laid out plain on a stone table, useful and unhidden, was the actual currency down here. Not his story, not his conscience. This. How many summers have you done this? She asked next, not looking up from her writing, reading columns, predicting them before they show themselves. 8 years scouting, Silas said. Before that, near enough a lifetime just watching. My father broke horses for a living. Taught me young that most creatures' horse, man, army column, didn't matter which telegraph, their next move a good while before they make it, if you're patient enough and humble enough to actually watch instead of assume. Humble. Suhala glanced up at that, something almost skeptical in her expression. Not a word I would have chosen for a man who rode cavalry 8 years. Wasn't humble the whole 8 years, Silas admitted. Took some hard lessons to get there. Losing men under bad orders does that to a man, if he's paying attention. Makes him a great deal more careful about what he assumes he already understands. Suhala considered that and returned to her writing, and the quiet that settled between them afterward carried less suspicion in it than the quiet that had opened the session an hour before. He gave them more over the following days. Patrol rhythms, how a column moved when it expected trouble versus when it didn't. The particular carelessness that crept into cavalry, thinking after enough quiet months, the kind of carelessness that got columns ambushed and got scouts like him promoted once a lifetime ago, back when promotion had still meant something to him. You talk about them like you still respect them, Nashota said once, arms crossed at the chamber's edge, watching him mark a ridgeline on the map with a stick of charcoal. Even after everything, I don't respect what they did, Silas said, not looking up. I respect what they're capable of doing again, if nobody accounts for it properly. Different thing entirely. Sounds like a fine distinction to hide behind. Maybe. He set the charcoal down, met her eyes straight on, because looking away from Nashota, he'd learned fast, only ever invited more trouble. Or maybe it's the only kind of respect that keeps people alive out here. Underestimate an enemy because you've decided to hate him instead of understand him, and he'll bury you while you're still busy hating. Nashota held his gaze a long moment, said nothing. But she didn't argue either, and from her, Silas was starting to understand. That silence was as close to agreement as he was ever likely to get. She found him alone, a few days later, at the map chamber, and this time she did not come armed with accusation. You marked the eastern ridge wrong, she said without preamble, jabbing a finger at his charcoal lines. There's a second approach there. Narrower. My mother showed it to me before she died. Most in this mountain don't know it exists anymore. Silas studied where she pointed, then looked up at her, surprised in a way he didn't bother hiding. You're helping me. I'm making sure the map's accurate, Nashota said, sharp, like the distinction mattered to her more than it should have. An inaccurate map gets people killed, regardless of who drew it or why. Appreciate it either way, Silas said, marking the correction carefully. Man could use a second set of eyes that don't want him dead. Change of pace, some days. Something almost like humor flickered across Nashota's hard face, there and gone before it could fully land. Don't mistake this for softening, Rourke, she said. I still don't trust you. Likely never will. Not the way Taki's letting herself trust you, or the way Suhala's decided to. But I've buried enough of my own people to know the difference between a man working against us and a man working, genuinely, for something bigger than his own skin. You've shown me the second kind these past weeks. I'll grant you that much, and not 1 ounce more. That's more than I expected from you, Silas admitted. I'll take it. You should, Nashota said, already turning to leave. It's not an offer I make twice. She left him there, and Silas sat a long while afterward, turning the exchange over. Understanding that from a woman like Nashota, a woman who had stood over him with a blade in the dark and lowered it, only at the very last breath of her own restraint, this grudging, unsentimental correction to a hand-drawn map was its own kind of peace offering, more honest in its way than warmer words from softer mouths might have been. He gave them a great deal more over those first weeks than he'd expected he had left to give. He taught Sonsi and 3 other younger women to read a cavalry map, properly not just the drawn lines but the assumptions baked into them, the places where an army cartographer's laziness or arrogance left gaps a careful eye could exploit. He showed Yipa how a column's dust told its size and its hurry both, visible sometimes a full day before the column itself ever crested a ridge, if a watcher knew where to look and how long to wait without blinking. He spent 2 full days rebuilding a section of the False Passage's timber, bracing after it had begun to sag under its own long, unmaintained weight, working alongside 3 women who did not speak to him at all the first day, and spoke to him, grudgingly, in short practical sentences, by the second. None of it earned him trust outright. He understood that, and did not resent it, because Tulsa's warning had been fair, and he had no grounds to expect otherwise. But it earned him something adjacent to trust, a kind of provisional decency, extended a little further each week, the way you'd extend credit to a debtor who kept, so far, making good on every payment due. You work harder than most men I've known who had something to prove, Suhala observed once, watching him haul timber alongside Yepa, without complaint, sweat soaking through the shirt they'd given him to replace the one torn beyond saving. I do have something to prove, Silas said, not pausing in the work. Difference is, most men trying to prove something are trying to prove it to somebody else. I gave up trying to impress other people a long while back. This is closer to proving something to myself. Suhala considered that and said nothing further, but Silas caught her watching him a beat longer than the moment strictly required. The defense work came next, and it was there, more than anywhere, that he began to feel the shape of his own use taking hold in this place. He walked the upper passages with Suhala and two warriors he hadn't met properly yet, Yepa and Sunsisi, sisters by the look of them, quick with knives and quicker with opinions, and marked, one by one, the places where the tunnel system's design gave way to habit instead of strategy. Here, he said, at a wide bend where the passage opened into a small gallery before narrowing again. Anybody holds this bend with two rifles, they choke off the whole approach. But you've got no one posted here. Not even in daylight hours. We've never needed to, Yepa said, a little sharp, a little defensive, the way anyone gets when a stranger points out the soft spot in something they built with their own hands. Nobody's ever found this passage. Nobody's ever found it yet, Silas said. Not unkind. Just plain. I found the outer crack, half dead and delirious, stumbling in the dark. A patrol working this ground with real intent, real daylight, real time. They'd find more than I did, and faster. The sisters exchanged a look that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite agreement either. Something caught between the two, and Suhala cut through it before it could settle either direction. He's right, she said. Flat. Final. The kind of verdict that ended arguments in this place faster than any raised voice could. Post it. Starting tonight. It became a pattern over the following weeks. Silas finding the soft places, the habits worn comfortable by years without incident, and the community reluctant, proud, but not foolish, tightening them one by one. A second cistern, dug where a single point of failure had put the whole water supply at risk. A false passage, dug shallow, and left open on purpose, meant to swallow anyone who came hunting without a guide who knew the real turns. Warning cords, strung through the outer approaches, rigged to shake a string of bells deep in the mountain's belly if disturbed by anything heavier than wind. Tulsa watched all of it from a careful distance, saying little, but Silas noticed because noticing things had kept him alive for 8 years riding, and old habits die harder than most, that she stopped by the map chamber more often than strict necessity required. Stood in the doorway, watched him work, said nothing most days, but she watched. Once, she stayed long enough to speak. 12 years, she said, and no man has ever stood in this chamber and looked at our defenses without also, somewhere in the back of his mind, counting how he might one day use that knowledge against us. Silas set down the charcoal, looked at her straight, because half measures never played well with Tulsa. He'd learned that much fast. I won't tell you I'm not thinking it, he said. Man would be a fool not to notice the shape of a thing he's been handed, but noticing isn't the same as wanting it. I notice the shape of a rattler too, every time I see one. Doesn't mean I'm angling to get bit. Tulsa's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, close enough, though, that Silas counted it as a small victory and said nothing further to spoil it. It was Taki who taught him the rest, not maps, not defenses, but the rhythm of the place itself, the parts that didn't show up on any chart. She came to fetch him most mornings now, under Tulsa's loose permission, walking him through the upper cavern on the pretense of showing him where his help was needed next, though both of them had stopped pretending. Somewhere around the second week, that pretense was the whole of it. You watch everyone, she said one morning, walking the cavern's rim beside him. Her pace matched easy to his still healing gait. Even now, even after weeks. Why? Old habit, Silas said. Scout doesn't survive long if he stops watching. Body forgets how to stop. Even once the reason's gone, has the reason gone. He considered that longer than the question may be warranted. No, he admitted. Not entirely. Man in my position learns fast. That trust granted isn't trust guaranteed to last. I watch because watching's kept me breathing this long. Old habits don't die, they just find new reasons to keep living. Taki was quiet a moment, studying the training ring below them, where a cluster of younger women worked knife drills under an instructor's sharp corrections. I watch too, she said finally. Everyone here does. It is not only your habit, Rourke. It is the whole shape of this place. A small, tired half-smile. We survived by never fully putting the watching down. Some days I wonder what it would feel like. To stop. Might feel like relief, Silas offered. Might feel like falling. Hard to know till you try it. And have you tried it? Since coming here, he thought about that a long moment, watching the training ring, watching the easy laughter drifting up from it despite the knife spucks, despite everything this place had survived, to still be laughing at all. Some, he admitted. More than I expected to. Which frightens me some days, if I'm honest with you. Why would it frighten you? Because a man who stops watching gets comfortable, Silas said. And comfortable men make mistakes. And mistakes, in a place like this, don't just cost the man who makes them. Taki studied him a long moment, something working behind her eyes he couldn't fully name. That is a heavy weight to carry, she said, for a man who owes this place nothing beyond his own survival. Maybe I owe it more than survival, Silas said, quiet, before he'd fully decided to say it out loud. Maybe that's the trouble. Neither of them said anything further on that, but something had shifted in the saying of it, and both of them, Silas suspected, felt the shift land somewhere it couldn't be easily unlanded from. She came to him again, a week later, at an hour when most of the mountain had gone quiet, and this time she carried nothing. No lamp, no pretense of an errand, just herself, sitting down across from him, at the low fire near the stone room he still slept in, though the iron door behind him now stood open more often than shut. I want to ask you something, Taki said, and I want you to answer it plainly. No dodging. No turning it into a story about somebody else's morning. All right? Do you regret finding this place? The question landed harder than he expected, and he took his time with it, because of an answer would have cheapened whatever she was actually asking underneath the words. No, he said finally. Costs me plenty. Some days, being watched, being weighed, carrying a debt I didn't earn on my own account. He met her eyes across the low fire. But no, I don't regret it. Man spends 5 years alone by choice, telling himself solitude's a kind of peace, and then he finds a place like this, full of people who survived worse than he ever did and kept building anyway. Makes the solitude look smaller than he'd let himself believe. Makes it look like hiding, mostly. Which it was. And now I don't know what it looks like, Silas admitted. Only that it doesn't look like hiding anymore. Taki was quiet a long while, the fire popping low between them, throwing small restless shadows across her face. I asked Suhala once, she said finally, whether it was foolish wanting to trust you. She said trust was never foolish by itself. Only the giving of it too soon, before it had been earned properly. A faint, almost rueful smile. I have spent 2 months deciding whether you have earned it yet. I still do not fully know the answer. Fair, Silas said. I don't fully know it either, if I'm honest. Some mornings I still expect to wake up back in that fever. None of this real. All of it just a dying man's last kindness to himself. And if it were, Taki said, softer now. A dying man's kindness. Would you choose it anyway, knowing it wasn't real? He looked at her a long moment, the fire between them, the whole quiet weight of the mountain settled around them like a held breath. Yes, he said, simple, unguarded, in a way he hadn't let himself be in longer than he could easily count. Every time. No question in me about that at all. Taki did not answer that directly. But she did not look away either, and the silence that followed carried more in it than either of them seemed willing, yet, to put into words. The saving happened 3 weeks into his freedom of the upper passages, and it happened fast, the way real danger always did, with none of the warning a story usually gives it. He was walking the training ring's edge, marking a weak point in the rope rigging, used for the climbing drills, when Sansi, younger of the 2 sisters, quicker to temper than her sister, but quicker to laugh too, lost her grip 40 feet up the practice wall and fell. Silas didn't think. There wasn't time to think, and thinking, he'd learned across 8 years of exactly this kind of moment, was often the thing that got a man killed instead of the thing that saved him. He was already moving, already under the fall line, already bracing, and he caught her, not clean, not painless, her weight driving him hard into the packed earth with a jolt that tore fresh pain through the healing wound in his side. But he caught her, and she came down alive instead of broken, gasping, wide-eyed, alive. The training ring went silent around them. Every woman in it stopped mid-motion, weapon still, breath held, staring. "You're hurt," Sansi managed, scrambling off him, seeing the way he'd gone pale, the way his hand had pressed instinctively to the wound at his side. "I'll live," Silas said, through gritted teeth, pushing himself upright. "Wasn't going to let you test that theory on the ground instead." Sansi stared at him a long moment, something complicated moving across her young face. Gratitude, yes, but also the particular shock of a person realizing, for the first time, in a bone-deep way rather than an abstract one, that the stranger in their midst had just spent his own healing body on her behalf, without a heartbeat's hesitation. "Why?" she said. Simply, "Why would you?" "Because you were falling," Silas said, like it was the only answer that existed, because in his mind, honestly, it was. Wasn't a decision, wasn't even a thought. Just you were falling. And I was close enough not to let you. Word of it moved through the cavern faster than any message could have traveled by mouth alone. By that evening, women who'd never once looked at him without a knife edge of suspicion in their gaze were looking at him differently. Not with trust, not yet. Tulsa's warnings still held true on that front, but with something that had started at last to make room for trust's possibility. Suhala found him afterward, rewrapping the wound he'd torn open, her expression unreadable in the low lamplight. "You could have let her fall," she said. "Would have cost you nothing. You are not yet one of us. No one would have blamed you for hesitating." "I would have blamed me," Silas said. "Simple. Plain. That's a debt I don't much care to owe myself." Suhala said nothing to that for a long moment, tying off the fresh bandage with the same brisk efficiency she always brought to the work. But when she finally spoke, something in her voice had changed, softened at the edges in a way it hadn't before. "Tulsa was right to make you prove yourself slow," she said. "But I begin to think, Rourke, that you would have proven yourself slow, regardless of whether we asked it of you. That is not nothing. In my experience, it is exceedingly rare." He asked her, once, why she'd been the one to argue for his usefulness that first night when every other voice in the chamber had wanted him dead, or bound and forgotten. Suhala considered the question a long while, sorting dried herbs into small clay jars with hands that never seemed to stop moving, even when her mind clearly had wandered somewhere else entirely. "I had a husband once," she said finally, not looking up. "Before this place. Before any of it, a good man, or so I believed, for the whole of the 10 years I knew him." Her hands stilled, briefly, over the herbs. "He was not the man from Tulsa's story. I want that understood plainly. He died of fever, ordinary and unremarkable, long before any of this began. But I learned something from loving him that I have never fully unlearned, since that a person's worth is not fixed at birth by what they are. Man, woman, soldier, outsider. It is proven, slowly, by what they do when nobody is forcing their hand. And you saw that in me, that first night." "I saw the possibility of it," Suhala corrected. "I have been wrong about possibilities before. I did not know that first night whether you would prove me right or wrong. I still did not know for certain until the day you caught Sansi, rather than let her fall." She resumed her sorting, brisk again, the moment of open reflection folding itself carefully back away. "I know now. Whatever comes of the rest of it, I know now." It was, Silas understood, as close to a declaration of trust as Suhala was ever likely to offer, and he carried the weight of it with him the rest of that day, quiet, grateful, turning it over the way he turned over everything that mattered to him and didn't quite know how to hold. Taki found him that same evening at the outer shaft, standing in the narrow column of true daylight that fell, brief and precious, through the screened opening in the rock each afternoon, before the sun moved too far west to reach it. Suhala told me, she said, coming to stand beside him in the light, about her husband. She doesn't often speak of him. Surprised she told me at all, Silas admitted. Didn't expect it. She wouldn't have, if she didn't already believe what she said afterward. Taki tilted her face up into the thin daylight, eyes closed, and Silas found himself watching her rather than the light itself, unable quite to help it. I have been thinking about what you asked me, weeks ago, whether I regretted speaking for you that first night. And I don't, she said, opening her eyes, meeting his directly. Though I want you to understand what that costs me to say, plainly. Every woman in this mountain carries a version of the morning that took everything from her. Mine happens to share a color of coat with the uniform you once wore. That is not a small thing to set aside, Silas. Some days I am not certain I have fully set it aside at all. Only that I have decided, deliberately, to let you prove yourself apart from it, one honest day at a time. That's more than I had any right to ask for, Silas said quiet. I know that. Don't take it lightly, whatever else I might get wrong along the way. Taki studied him a long moment in the fading column of light, something unguarded moving across her face that she usually kept carefully hidden behind the warrior's discipline. She wore like a second skin. There is a difference, she said, slow, like she was working the thought out even as she spoke it, between the man who wore that uniform and the man standing in front of me now. I did not believe that, the first weeks. I believed uniforms carried the men inside them, whole, unchangeable. I no longer believe that. I am not certain when the believing stopped. Only that it has. He wanted, badly, to close the small distance still standing between them in that narrow shaft of light. Didn't, though some old caution, or maybe simple respect for how much this admission had already cost her, held him where he stood. Taki, don't, she said but gently, a small, unsteady smile touching her mouth. Don't say anything yet. Let me have this much first, without either of us rushing past it toward whatever comes next. Some things are worth taking slow, even in a world that keeps insisting we don't have the time to spare for slow. He nodded, and they stood together in the thinning daylight, a while longer, saying nothing further, and Silas understood, standing there, that whatever came next between them and something, he was now fairly certain, would arrive on her timing, earned rather than rushed, the way every good thing in this mountain seemed to demand of the people who wanted to keep it. Not every day carried that kind of weight, though, and Silas found, somewhere in the second month, that the ordinary hours had begun accumulating into something that felt dangerously, almost like belonging. He learned the names of women he'd only known by silhouette before. Learned that the old woman he'd teaching children, no, not children, he corrected himself again. Young women barely past girlhood, the youngest the mountain had, was named Ahiga, and that she had outlived 3 husbands, and every one of her own children before finding her way here, and that she laughed often, loud and unguarded, in a way that seemed to Silas like its own quiet act of defiance against everything that should have broken her. He learned the rotation of the cook fires, and found himself, more than once, elbow deep in the same grinding work he'd watched from a distance his first week, trading rough jokes with women who'd have put a knife in him without hesitation 2 months prior. He was not, he understood clearly, one of them, would likely never be entirely one of them, not in the way that mattered most, not with the law standing where it stood and the memory of 12 years ago still fresh enough to flinch at. But he was, increasingly, something adjacent to belonging, and some evenings, sitting near the communal fire with a bowl of stew in his hands and the low murmur of 100 conversations moving around him, he let himself simply exist inside that adjacency without picking at its edges to see how far it might tear. Those were good evenings. He counted them carefully, the way a poor man counts coin, because some part of him understood, even then, that good evenings in a place like this were never guaranteed to last. One such evening, near the middle of the second month, Ahiga called the younger women to the great cavern center for what Taki explained, quietly, was a storytelling and old practice, kept faithfully since the mountain's founding. He meant to pass the community's history down through voice rather than only through scar and silence. Silas sat at the gathering's edge, uninvited but not turned away, and listened as Ahiga's voice rose and fell across the cavern, telling of the first winter down here, of women who had arrived with nothing but grief and stubbornness and had built, slowly, stone by carried stone, a place the desert itself seemed to have agreed to forget existed. He did not understand every word. Much of it moved in a rhythm and a tongue that stayed just beyond his reach. But he understood the shape of it well enough: loss, and then labor, and then, against every reasonable expectation, something that had grown to look very much like a life worth living. When the telling finished, Ahiga's eyes found him across the fire, sharp despite her age, and she said something to Taki that made Taki laugh, quick and surprised before translating. "She says you listen like a man who has lost something too," Taki said. "She wants to know what." Silas considered the question a long moment, aware of a dozen eyes now turned his way, aware that whatever he said here would travel through this mountain faster than any council decree. "Tell her," he said, finally, "that I lost the version of myself that thought walking away from a wrong was the same as fixing it. Took me 5 years and a half dead, crawl through a crack in the rock to understand the difference." Taki translated, and something moved through the gathered women. At that not full acceptance, not yet, but a kind of collective softening, brief and real, the sort of thing that couldn't be commanded by any council vote, only earned, slow, one honest evening at a time. Ahiga nodded once, satisfied, and turned back to the fire, and the evening resumed its ordinary rhythm around him, and Silas sat there a long while afterward, feeling something in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in 5 years, and did not yet have a name for, and was, for once, in no hurry to name. Kessa's fire burned low and separate, off at the cavern's edge. The way the guards murmured conversation through his door weeks ago had told him it would. Silas hadn't gone looking for it deliberately. That was the truth of how he found it. Whatever suspicion it might later invite, he'd simply been walking the outer paths on Tulsa's errand, carrying a message about the water rotation to a woman 2 chambers over, and the path had taken him past the 3rd fire on its way. He might have walked on. Should have, probably, given everything. Tulsa had told him about names he wasn't meant to learn and faces he wasn't meant to know, because that was the sensible course, the careful course. The course that kept a man's hard-won standing intact and his nose out of business that wasn't his to carry. Except he heard a voice that didn't belong. Male. Low. Careful in the particular way of a man used to speaking business in places he shouldn't be. Silas stopped in the shadow of the passage mouth, out of the firelight's reach, and listened, because listening had kept him alive for 8 years and old habits, once again refused to die, simply because the reason for them had changed shape. 6 rifles this trip, the voice was saying. Repeating action. Same as I promised. Powder and shot to match. Same terms as before hides, and the silver you're still holding from the spring trade. It's not enough, Kessa's voice answered, low, urgent, carrying an edge of something that sounded to Silas's ear, less like greed and more like fear dressed up as negotiation. You said a dozen, last time we spoke. The council won't wait forever, Voss, and neither will whatever's hunting this country closer every season. A dozen costs more than hides and silver, Kessa. You know that. Then I'll find more to trade. I always have. See that you do. Because I won't keep making this ride forever, not for 6 rifles worth of profit, and a woman who won't even let me past the 3rd fire to see what I'm actually risking my neck to arm. There was a pause then, long enough that Silas held his own breath without quite meaning to, and when Voss spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, more careful, the voice of a man circling toward a question he'd been saving. There's talk, some places I ride, Voss said, about soldiers working this country closer than usual this season. Somebody up the chain got interested again, after years of nobody caring much where the rumors came from. A beat. You wouldn't know anything about why that might be. Would you, Kessa? No, Kessa said. Too fast. and even from the shadow of the passage mouth, Silas heard the fear underneath the denial. "See that it stays that way," Voss said. "I don't ride for free, and I sure as hell don't ride into a search pattern for a woman who can't keep her own house quiet." Silas eased back further into the shadow, mind working fast, cold, the old scout calculus running itself out almost without his say-so. A traitor, meeting a woman cast out of council, deep in territory that was supposed to be the most closely guarded secret this side of the border, exchanging rifles for silver and hides in the dead hours when the rest of the cavern slept. He understood, standing there in the dark, exactly what he'd just walked into, and exactly how badly it could end for every soul in this mountain if the wrong person ever traced that traitor's path back through the rock to its source. He left before either voice at the fire noticed him, but the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone swallowed whole, and he carried it with him the rest of that night, turning it over, weighing it, trying to find the version of the next morning that didn't end in somebody's blood. He did not sleep, because how could a man sleep, carrying a secret that size, in a place where secrets this size had already cost 12 lives, or more, or however many the true number was, that Tulsa had never quite brought herself to say aloud. Tell Tulsa, and Kessa's exile became something far worse than silence at council. Tell no one, and he became in his own mind, if nowhere else, exactly the kind of man Tulsa's law had been written to guard against a man who knew a danger to this place and chose, for reasons of his own, to sit on it. Except it wasn't that simple, which he kept circling back to, lying there in the dark, turning the whole mess over one more time. Because Kessa wasn't selling secrets, wasn't betraying anyone to soldiers. She was buying rifles, arming this place against exactly the danger Silas himself had spent 3 weeks helping fortify them against. So maybe it wasn't betrayal at all. Maybe it was desperation, dressed up in a shape the council had already voted against once and would vote against again, harder, if they ever learned it hadn't stopped, until he thought of Ituha, caught in the middle of all of it, loving an ant the council had silenced, and he understood, with a sick lurch low in his gut, exactly whose life would be torn hardest apart if this ever came to light. He was still turning it over, unresolved, when morning found him, hollow-eyed and no closer to an answer than he'd been at midnight. Ituha found him first, before he'd decided anything, which felt in hindsight less like coincidence and more like the kind of trouble that always seemed to know exactly when a man's guard was down. "You look like a man who hasn't slept," she said, dropping down beside him at the edge of the training ring, her voice carrying its usual easy defiance, though something underneath it had gone tighter than usual, more careful. "Didn't sleep much," Silas admitted. "Why?" He studied her a long moment, weighed it, decided, finally, that a lie here would only compound whatever was coming, and something in him the same. Something that had caught Sansi before she hit the ground refused to let him build this particular conversation on a foundation he'd have to tear down later. "I heard something last night," he said. "At the third fire. Wasn't looking for it. Found it anyway." Ituha went very still. "What did you hear?" "A traitor. Voss," she called him. "Rifles for hides and silver." He kept his voice low level, watching her face for whatever it might give away before her words did. "I think you already know that, Ituha. I think that's exactly why you're sitting here right now, instead of avoiding me the way you have every other morning, since you told me about Kessa." Ituha's jaw worked, once hard, and for a moment he thought she might simply get up and leave, refuse the whole conversation outright. But she didn't. She sat there, staring out at the training ring, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the easy defiance she usually wore like armor. "She's trying to protect us," Ituha said. "That's the whole of it, whatever it looks like from outside. She watched the council vote to stay poorly armed, rather than risk one more outside contact, and she couldn't live with it. Couldn't live with watching us go into another fight the way we went into the last one." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last few words. "I begged her to stop. After the vote. Told her it would end badly if the council ever found out. She told me some risks are worth taking, even when nobody else agrees they're worth taking. Does Tulsa know?" No. Sharp. Immediate. And if you tell her, I haven't decided what I'm going to do, Silas said. Honest. Because it was the only thing he had to offer her that wasn't already tangled up in a lie. I've been sitting with it all night, and I still haven't found the bottom of it. Then let me tell you the bottom of it, Ituha said, turning to face him fully now, something fierce and pleading both at once burning behind her eyes. If you tell Tulsa, Kessa doesn't just lose her voice, she loses everything. Maybe her place here entirely. Maybe worse, if Nashota gets any say in how it's handled, and Nashota always gets a say. Her hands had curled into fists in her lap, white-knuckled. And I know what you're thinking. I know it looks exactly like the story Tulsa told you, the man 12 years back, the betrayal, the blood on the stone. But Kessa isn't selling us out, Rourke. She's the opposite of that story. She's trying to make sure it never happens to us again, and the council's too frightened by the last betrayal to see the difference. Frightened people don't always see differences clearly, Silas said, quiet. That's true. But frightened people build laws for a reason too, Ituha, even when the reason gets applied clumsy sometimes. I understand why Kessa's doing it. Doesn't mean I understand what happens if the wrong soldier ever follows that traitor's tracks back to this mountain. Ituha's eyes filled, quick, and she blinked them hard, furious at her own tears, in a way that told him more about her than any speech could have. Then what do I do? She said, and it came out smaller than anything he'd heard from her yet. The defiance gone entirely, just a young woman caught between two loyalties that both felt like betrayal. Tell me, Rourke, you've been thinking about it all night. Tell me what a man who refused an order once, at real cost to himself, thinks a person's supposed to do when every choice in front of them costs somebody they love. He didn't have a clean answer. He told her so, plain, because false comfort would have cost her more than honesty, even honesty this unfinished. I don't know yet, he said. But I know this much. Whatever I decide, I'm not deciding it to hurt Kessa, or you, or anybody in this mountain. I'm trying to find the version of the truth that keeps the most people breathing. That's the only compass I've got, Ituha. Wish I had a better one to offer you. Ituha studied him a long moment, and something in her posture eased, just slightly, not trust exactly, but the beginning of something that might, given time, grow into it. That's more honest than I expected, she said finally, standing, brushing dust from her knees like she was brushing off the whole conversation along with it. I suppose I'll have to settle for honest. Everybody down here always does, eventually. She left him there, and Silas sat a long while after, no closer to a decision, watching the training ring below and wondering, not for the first time, what kind of man he was going to turn out to be, now that the choice in front of him had teeth in it. He went to Suhala first, not Tulsa, because Suhala had proven, across these weeks, that she weighed things before she acted on them, and Silas needed, badly, to weigh this with someone who wouldn't simply reach for the nearest blade. He told her everything. The traitor, the rifles, Kessa's fear disguised as negotiation, Ituha's tears. He left nothing out because half a truth, he'd decided somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn, was worse than no truth at all in a matter this size. Suhala listened without interrupting, her face giving away almost nothing until he'd finished, and then she sat a long while in silence, turning it over the way she turned over every problem, methodical, unhurried, weighing costs against costs. You understand what you've just handed me, she said finally. I do. And you came to me instead of Tulsa. Why? Because Tulsa's first instinct is the law, Silas said. And the law, in this case, might be exactly wrong for what's actually happening. I wanted somebody to help me see clear before that law gets applied to a woman who isn't actually the threat it was written for. Suhala studied him a long moment, something moving behind her eyes that looked, to Silas's reading of her, almost like respect, though tangled up hard with worry. Kessa is reckless, she said finally. But you are right that she is not what the law fears most. The law fears betrayal, a man or woman selling our location, our numbers, our weaknesses, to the people hunting us. Kessa is doing the opposite of that. Foolishly, dangerously, but not out of betrayal. She exhaled, slow, and for the first time since he'd known her, Saha looked, briefly, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The trouble is that Tulsa will not hear that distinction easily, not after 12 years of the other kind of story living in her chest instead. Then how do we make her hear it? Carefully, Suhala said, and soon, because a secret this size does not stay buried. Rourke, not in a place built as close together as this one. If you found it stumbling past a fire on an errand, others will find it too, and better it comes from a mouth that can put the whole truth beside it than a whisper that arrives half-finished and twice as frightening. They sat with that a long while, the lamp guttering low between them, and Silas understood, with the particular weight of a man who had once refused one order and paid for it in solitude for 5 years straight, that he was about to walk into another room where the cost of speaking plainly might land on someone besides himself. He found, turning it over one final time, that he was going to speak anyway, because staying silent, he'd learned the hard way once already in his life, had never once actually kept anybody safe. It had only ever delayed the reckoning, and made it crueler when it finally came. Before that reckoning arrived, though, the mountain's other danger found its way to them first, and it came, as danger in this country always seemed to. Riding, a runner came in from the outer watch near dusk, breathless, her face pale under the dust of a hard climb down. Yeppa, Silas realized, the sharper-tempered of the two sisters, and whatever temper she carried most days had been burned clean out of her by whatever she'd just seen. Riders, she said, gasping the word out before she'd even fully stopped moving. Cavalry, 6 miles south, moving slow, working the ground like they're tracking something. The training ring emptied in seconds. Women scattering to posts Silas hadn't even known existed till he watched them fill, and Tulsa arrived at the map chamber within minutes, her face set in the particular stillness of a leader doing arithmetic she'd hoped, for 12 quiet years, never to have to do again. How many? She said. Yeppa counted a dozen, Cheppy answered, already unrolling a second. More detailed maps Silas hadn't been shown before. Moving in a search pattern. Not a patrol on its regular route. Somebody sent them looking, specific for something. Or someone, Nashota said, and every eye in the chamber found Silas at once, the accusation sitting unspoken but entirely clear in the sudden quiet. Wasn't followed. Silas flat, meeting each set of eyes in turn. I've spent 8 years covering my own tracks in this country. If I'd been careless enough to lead soldiers here, they'd have found this mountain a month ago. Not now. Then what changed? Tulsa said, quiet, and the question carried weight enough to still the whole chamber. 12 years this place has gone unfound. Now, within 2 months of your arrival, cavalry works this ground with purpose. Coincidence asks a great deal of me, Rourke, and I am not in the habit of granting it easily. Silas felt the floor of his own certainty shift, because Tulsa wasn't wrong to ask it, and he knew, standing there, that the honest answer wasn't going to make anybody in that chamber breathe easier. There's a traitor working this territory, he said finally, the words costing him more than he'd expected, because he knew exactly whose fire they were about to burn down along with his own hard-won standing. Making runs to somebody inside this mountain. Rifles for silver and hide. If a man like that's been riding the same ground repeatedly, careless, drawing his own trail both back and forth, the far likelier reason for cavalry interest than anything I brought with me. The chamber went dead silent, the kind of silence that has a weight all its own, pressing down on every face in the room. Who? Tulsa said, and her voice had dropped into something low and dangerous that Silas had not heard from her before, not even that first night with the knives drawn. He hesitated exactly 1 breath, long enough to feel, in that single held breath, the full weight of what he was about to set loose. Kessa, he said. What followed was not the blade. Nashota had promised him weeks before in the dark of his cell. It was worse, in its way a slow, grinding unraveling that pulled half the mountain into its wake. Council called within the hour. Voices raised in the chamber Silas had first stood judged in. Kessa herself, dragged before it pale, and defiant in equal measure, Ituha at her side refusing, flatly, to be sent away. You knew, Tulsa said to Ituha, and the betrayal in her voice cut deeper, Silas thought, than any accusation aimed at Kessa herself. You knew, and you said nothing. I tried to stop her, Ituha said, voice shaking but not breaking. I told her the risk, she wouldn't hear it. What was I supposed to do? Tulsa hand my own blood over to a council that already voted to silence her once. You were supposed to trust that this family protects its own better than silence does, Tulsa said. That is what you were supposed to do. Protects its own. Kessa's voice cracked through the chamber. Sharp, bitter, silent no longer. Is that what you call it? Voting me out of the circle for saying, plainly, that a dozen old rifles won't hold against what's coming. I did not sell our location. I did not sell our numbers. I trade silver for the one thing that might actually keep us breathing when soldiers finally do find this mount. And you would have me silent about that too. I would have you honest about it, Tulsa said, and her voice, though quieter than Kessa's, carried further, filled the whole chamber the way it always did. Honest in council, where the whole weight of the decision could be carried together, instead of alone, in secret, by a woman who decided she alone knew better than the rest of us what risk was worth taking. Because the council doesn't listen, Kessa shot back. Not to me. Not since the vote. You silenced my voice and then act surprised when I stopped using it in the room you took it from me. The argument that followed ran long into the night, voices rising and falling like weather, moving through the chamber Nashota, predictably, arguing hardest for the harshest punishment the law allowed. Her old grief given fresh fuel by the fresh danger, Suhala arguing, quiet but unmovable, for the distinction between reckless love and true betrayal. Taki saying little, but watching Ituha with an expression that told Silas she remembered, better than most in that chamber, what it cost to lose everyone in a single dawn, and understood, therefore, exactly what Kessa had truly been trying to prevent. Silas stood at its edge, saying little, understanding that whatever came of this exile, forgiveness, something harder to name lodged in between the two, the weight of, having set it in motion, would sit on him regardless of how the council's judgment finally landed. It was near midnight when Tulsa finally spoke the decision, her voice hoarse with the hours of argument behind it. Kessa will not be exiled, she said, and something loosened, audibly, across the chamber at that. A held breath released all at once. But the trade ends tonight, permanently, and she will answer, from this day forward, to Suhala directly, for any contact beyond these walls, however small. Her eyes found Silas hard, unreadable, and you, Rourke, will understand that bringing me this truth does not erase the fact that cavalry rides 6 miles south of us tonight, drawn by exactly the carelessness you uncovered. We will deal with what you have given us. But we will deal, too, with what it has already cost. Silas held her gaze and did not look away. I understand, he said. I'd rather you angry at the truth than grateful for a lie. Angry, at least, we can work with. Something in Tulsa's face shifted at that. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of grudging recognition that Silas had chosen again. The harder road when the easier one had been sitting right there for the taking. Ituha found him the following morning, sitting alone at the training ring's edge, and did not sit beside him right away. Stood, instead, arms crossed, working something over before she let herself say it. She's not angry at you, Ituha said finally. Kessa, I want you to know that, since I imagine you've spent the night assuming otherwise. Wouldn't have blamed her if she was. She said you did the only honest thing available to you. Says she'd have done the same, in your place, however much it costs her now. Ituha's arms unfolded, slow, and she finally sat, dropping down beside him with a heaviness that hadn't been there in her easy stride 2 months before. I was angry, though. I'll admit that plainly. Angry at you, and angrier at myself, forever believing a secret that size could stay buried forever. Secrets that size rarely do, Silas said. Learned that the hard way myself, more than once, I know. Ituha was quiet a moment, watching the training ring below, empty at this early hour, the ropes and practice weapons standing idle in the gray morning light. Tulsa's punishment was lighter than I feared. Suhala's watch instead of exile. I think, in her own way, That's Tulsa's mercy, showing through the law, rather than around it. Think you might be right about that. I owe you something too, Ituha said, and it clearly cost her to say it. The words come slower than her usual quick defiance allowed. You could have gone straight to Tulsa the morning you overheard it. Could have skipped me entirely, skipped the warning, let the council's judgment fall on Kessa, without a moment's grace. Given first. You didn't. I don't fully understand why, but I noticed it, and I'm grateful for it, even if gratitude doesn't come easy to me most days. Didn't do it for gratitude, Silas said. Did it because you deserved to hear it from somebody who wasn't going to twist it into a weapon first. Seemed like the decent thing. Turns out, decent's not always the same as easy, but I've made my peace with that trade a while back now. Ituha studied him a long moment, something in her young, sharp-edged face softening into an expression that looked, for the first time since he'd known her, almost like the beginning of real trust. I think you might actually be one of the better ones. Rourke, she said, echoing words she'd offered him weeks before, back when he was still a stranger bound behind an iron door. Don't let it go to your head. I still reserve the right to reconsider. Wouldn't expect anything less, Silas said, and something that was almost a real smile passed between them before she rose and left him to the empty ring in the gray morning light alone. The riders did not come closer that night, nor the next, holding their search pattern 6 miles south, with a patience that unsettled Silas more than a direct approach would have. Patient soldiers were dangerous soldiers. He knew that better than anyone in this mountain, until the second night, when patience gave way briefly to something closer to a probe. A pair of riders broke from the main column near dusk, working a narrow wash that ran closer to the mountain's outer approaches than anything the search had risked before, and Silas found himself crouched beside Yepa on the outer ridge, breath held, watching 2 soldiers walk their horses along ground that lay less than a mile from the false passage's outer mouth. They're close, Yepa whispered, her hand tight on her bow, knuckles pale, even in the fading light. Too close, Silas agreed. Low. But watch how they're moving. Not searching hard, just walking the wash, easy, like men killing time before dark, rather than men who've found a true trail. How do you know the difference? Because a man who thinks he's close moves different. Slower, quieter, eyes working the high ground, instead of just the ground in front of his horse. He kept his own eyes fixed on the pair, cataloging every small detail the way 8 years of scouting had trained him to. These 2 aren't close. Not yet. But if that wash draws them back tomorrow and the day after, working it a little further, each time that's a different story. That's a column starting to trust its own instincts. They watched a long while longer, until the 2 riders finally turned back toward the main column, swallowed by the dusk, and Yepa let out a breath she'd clearly been holding the whole while. How much time, she asked, before instinct becomes certainty? For them. Depends on how patient the man leading them is, Silas said quiet, though something cold had already settled low in his gut. Some old and unwelcome recognition, stirring at the edges of a shape he hadn't yet let himself name aloud. And I've got a bad feeling, Yepa, that patience isn't a thing this particular man ever ran short of. They climbed back down together in silence, and Silas carried that cold recognition with him the rest of the night, unable yet to prove it, but unable to shake the growing certainty of exactly whose hand was steering that column's slow, deliberate patience. It was 3 nights later, watching the search pattern from the outer ridge along Sataki, that he saw the detail that changed everything, because the column had shifted its pattern, subtle but unmistakable, to a man who'd spent 8 years reading exactly this kind of movement. No longer the wide, patient sweep of a search, still uncertain of its ground, but something tighter now, more deliberate, the particular narrowing focus of hunters who believed, correctly or not, that they had finally found the right country to be hunting in. A rider broke from the column's edge, moving to confer with another near the rear, and something about the man's bearing the particular way he sat a horse, spine too straight, the deliberate economy of every gesture, honed by years of command, until it became less a habit than a signature snagged hard on a memory. Silas had spent 5 years trying to bury. "What is it?" Taki said, watching his face change beside her in the dark. "Nothing," Silas said too fast, and even he heard how thin it sounded. "Rourke." Her hand found his arm, steady, insistent. "What is it?" He kept his eyes on the distant column, on that one rider, on the particular set of shoulders that had once, a lifetime ago, given him an order he'd refused with everything he had, which made no sense, which was exactly the kind of thing a tired mind conjured out of shadow and distance and old wounds too long unhealed. Except the more he watched, the more the shape refused to dissolve back into coincidence, the way he needed it to. "I know that man," he said, and his voice had gone somewhere flat and far away, somewhere he hadn't let it go in 5 years. "Or I think I do. Been a long time." Man doesn't forget a shape like that, though. Not one that gave him the order that ended everything. Taki went very still beside him. "Your captain," she said. "Not a question." "If I'm right," Silas said, "worse than captain. Colonel, last I knew, and rising. Man like that doesn't come hunting a rumor, with a dozen riders, and this much patience, unless fit, somebody's given him a reason to believe the rumor's worth the ride." He felt the ground shift under everything he'd built these past 2 months, the trust, the work, the small, unbarred mercy of a door left open, because if he was right about the shape riding that ridgeline, then this had stopped in the space of a single held breath, being a story about a hidden mountain and a wounded stranger. Silas Rourke had spent 5 years telling himself the past stayed buried if a man rode far enough and quiet enough away from it. He understood now, watching that distant column hold its patient line, exactly how badly he'd wanted that to be true, and exactly how little the wanting had ever actually mattered. "You're certain?" Taki said, quiet, though her grip on his arm hadn't loosened. "No," he admitted. "Distance is too far. Light's too poor. Could be wrong." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped lower, rougher, honest in a way that cost him something to give. "But I've spent 5 years not being wrong about the shape of that particular man on a horse, and every instinct I've got, the same ones that have kept me breathing this long, is telling me I'm not wrong now either." "Then what does it mean?" Taki asked. "If you're right." Silas was quiet a long moment, turning the question over, because the honest answer frightened him more than he wanted to admit out loud, even to her. "It means the men out there aren't just hunting a rumor of ghost women stealing horses," he said finally. "It means somebody up that chain has a reason, personal, to keep pushing this search long after any sensible officer would have called it off and moved his men to easier ground. And I can only think of one reason a man like that keeps a search alive past all reason." He looked at her, and something old and tired and afraid moved plain across his face, unhidden for once. "Me. He's not hunting your mountain, Taki. Not really. I think, in the end, he's hunting me. And your mountain just happens to be standing in the one place I finally stopped running." "We need to tell Tulsa," Taki said, already turning. "We do," Silas agreed, though something cold and old had settled into his chest, that no amount of telling was going to shift loose. "But Taki, if it's him, if it's truly him out there, this isn't cavalry stumbling onto a rumor anymore. This is a man who spent 5 years wondering what happened to the scout, who refused him. Finally close enough to find out." He looked back once more at that distant, patient column, holding its searchline steady in the dark, and understood, with a certainty that settled into his bones like winter, that whatever came next would not simply test this mountain's defenses. It would test him. Directly, by name, in a way none of Tulsa's laws had ever been written to prepare either of them for. Tulsa took the news, the way she took everything still, silent, weighing it before she let it move her at all. But Silas watched something pass behind her eyes as he spoke, the colonel's rank and the particular history that bound them, and understood that even a woman who had survived 12 years of preparing for exactly this kind of danger had never quite let herself imagine it, arriving, wearing a face already known to the man she'd chosen to trust. "You are certain of his name," she said when he'd finished. "Draycott," Silas said. "Colonel, if my memory of the promotion list still holds true, Man doesn't forget the name attached to an order like that one, Tulsa. Wish to God some mornings that I could. And you believe he searches for you specifically, not merely for rumor of us. I believe both are true now, tangled together past separating, Silas said. Rumor of ghost women might have started this search. But a man like Draycott doesn't keep a dozen riders in the field this long, this patient, chasing rumor alone. Somewhere along the way, something told him the rumor, and I might be standing in the same country. And once a man like that gets a scent like that in his teeth, he doesn't let it go easy, not for pride's sake, not for 5 years of wondering whether the scout who refused him ever paid for it, the way Draycott believes he should have. Tulsa was quiet a long while, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Silas hadn't heard from her before, not the flat authority of judgment, but something closer to a leader counting a cost she had hoped, against all 12 years of hard-won experience, never to have to count again. Then we are no longer simply hidden, she said. We are found, in every way that matters, whether his riders reach these walls, tomorrow or a season from now. That changes everything I have built this mountain to withstand. Her eyes found Silas, hard, searching, though something in them had softened, fractionally, into something almost like shared burden, rather than pure suspicion. You brought this to me plainly, as you brought Kess's trade to me plainly. I will remember that, Rourke, whatever comes of the fight ahead of us. Wish plain truth was worth more than it seems to be, some days, Silas said, quiet. But I'll take whatever credit you're willing to extend me. Feels like I'm going to need it before this is finished. Tulsa almost smiled at that. Almost. And in the almost, Silas found something to hold on to, walking back through the dark toward whatever the mountain's next reckoning was going to demand of all of them. Suhala caught up with him in the passage outside the council chamber, her face drawn with the same tired weight the whole mountain seemed to be carrying now. You know this man, she said. Truly know him. Not merely his shape on a distant ridge. Knew him, Silas corrected. 5 years is a long while. Man can change plenty in that time. But some things don't change, in my experience. Draycott built his whole career on finishing what he started. Wasn't a virtue in him, from where I stood. Was closer to a sickness. He couldn't leave a loose thread alone if his life depended on it. And I imagine 5 years of wondering what became of the scout who defied him in front of half his command, hasn't done anything to cure that particular sickness. Then he will not simply withdraw, Suhala said, even if his search here turns up nothing this season. No, Silas said. He won't. Man like that, once he's got a scent, keeps pulling the thread till the whole garment unravels. His own included if it comes to that. He met her eyes, grim. We're not simply hiding from a search pattern anymore, Suhala. We're standing between a man and the one unfinished piece of his own pride he spent 5 years unable to let go of. That's a different kind of danger than any law Tulsa's ever had to write for. Suhala was quiet a long while, turning that over with the same careful weighing she brought to every hard problem. Then we will need more than walls and warning cords, she said finally. We will need a plan that accounts for a man who does not quit. Will you help build it? Already building it, Silas said. Been building it in my head since the moment I recognized that shape on the ridge. Wish I had better news to offer you than that. But it's the truth, and I figure you'd rather have the truth than comfort. Same as always. Always, Suhala agreed, something almost like a tired smile touching her mouth. Bring what you have to Tulsa by morning. We will need every hour we can still claim as ours before this turns into something none of us can fully control. She left him there, and Silas stood a long while in the empty passage, already turning the coming fight over in his mind. Every defense he'd helped build these past 2 months, every weakness still unaddressed, every hour that separated this mountain from whatever Draycott's patience finally decided to unleash upon it. He found Taki again that same night, sitting alone near the outer watch, long after the council had scattered to its separate fires to carry the news to daughters and sisters and old grief alike. You didn't have to tell her everything, she said when he sat beside her. The old order, the refusal, Draycott's reason for hunting you personal instead of simply military. You could have given her only what mattered to our defense. Could have, Silas agreed. But half a truth cost this mountain enough already. With Kessa, wasn't going to repeat that mistake twice in the same season, not when the stakes just got a great deal higher than rifles and silver. Taki studied him a long moment in the dark, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something quieter, more private than the council chamber's harder currency of truth and consequence. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Of him. Of Dracot." Silas considered the question honestly, turning it over the way he turned over everything that cost him something to answer. "Some," he admitted. "Man spends 5 years running from a shape in his memory. He doesn't stop being afraid of it just because the running finally stops. But I'll tell you what frightens me worse, Taki." He looked at her, and something raw moved across his face, unguarded. "It's not Dracot finding me. It's Dracot finding this. Finding you. All of you. Because of me. Because some old grudge of his finally led him to the one door in this whole territory he never should have been given cause to knock on. That is not a burden that belongs to you alone," Taki said, fierce, sudden. "We built these walls. We dug these tunnels. We trained for exactly this, longer than you have been alive to understand what training for it costs. If Dracot comes, he does not come to a mountain of victims waiting to be found, Silas. He comes to a mountain that has survived worse than one angry colonel and his dozen riders." Something in the way she said his given name the first time, he realized. She'd used it instead of Rourke landed harder in his chest than the reassurance itself. "I hear you," he said, quiet. "I do. But hearing it, and believing it clean through, without the fear talking underneath, that's a harder thing to manage some nights than you might expect." "Then don't manage it alone," Taki said. Simple, and reached for his hand in the dark, her fingers finding his without hesitation, without the careful distance she'd kept between them for 2 long months. "Whatever comes next, you don't carry it alone anymore, Rourke. Silas." A small, unsteady breath, whichever name earns it. "You don't carry it alone." He held her hand back, and neither of them spoke further, the two of them sitting together at the mountain's edge, while somewhere below, the fires of 100 women, who had already survived one impossible winter, burned steady against the dark. And somewhere beyond the ridge, 6 miles south, and closing by degrees no one could yet measure, an old reckoning waited patiently for its hour to finally arrive. He did not sleep that night either, which was becoming, he thought, something of a pattern down here. Sleep traded away one crisis at a time, until a man forgot what an easy night even felt like, because his mind kept circling the same worn path. Dracot, the shape of him on that ridge, the particular cruelty of a coincidence this size, 5 years and 100 miles of hard, deliberate solitude, and still the old debt found him anyway, dragged along behind a column of patient riders, like something that had never once stopped hunting, even when Silas had convinced himself the hunting had finally ended, until he thought of the village. He always ended up there eventually, no matter which direction the circling started from. The dawn light on smoke that shouldn't have been rising. The particular silence that followed, worse than any sound could have been. Except this time the thought didn't stop there, the way it usually did, worn smooth by 5 years of repetition into a wound he'd learned to carry without examining too closely. This time it kept going, which frightened him some, turning it over in the dark, because it kept going toward a question he hadn't let himself ask plainly before. Not what happened that morning, not what he'd failed to stop, but what happened next. Now, if Dracot's patience finally ran its course, and that column started climbing instead of merely watching. So he made himself stop, made himself breathe, slow, the way he'd taught younger scouts once, a lifetime ago, before any of this. In through the nose, held, out slow again. It didn't fix anything, didn't answer the question waiting at the bottom of all that circling, but it got him through to morning, which was, some nights, the only victory a man could reasonably expect to claim. Morning came pale and gray through the outer shaft's narrow column of light, and Silas rose to meet it the way he'd risen, to meet every hard morning of the last 5 years, tired, unresolved, but moving forward regardless. because moving forward was the only direction that had ever done him any good. Somewhere below, the mountain was already stirring awake around him, unaware, most of it, that the patient danger holding 6 miles south carried a face he knew, a debt he owed, and a reckoning that would not. He understood now with total certainty, wait very much longer to finally arrive at their door. The plans Silas brought to Talsatat. That morning was not a good plan. He told her so plainly because lying about it now, at this hour, would have cost more than either of them could afford. He'd spent the whole night before building it, alone, in the map chamber, charcoal worn down to a stub between his fingers, because sleep hadn't come, because sleep wasn't coming for anybody in this mountain anymore, not with Dracot's patience finally, visibly running its course 6 miles south and closing, which left him with hours instead, hours to trace every corridor, every choke point, every soft place he'd hardened these past 2 months, and every place he hadn't hardened enough, until the map in front of him stopped looking like stone and started looking like something closer to a wager, lives. On one side, a stubborn man's grudge on the other, and no way to know which side would weigh heavier when morning finally arrived. A good plan, he said, standing over the map table with Suhala and Nashoda flanking him, Talsa seated across, unmoving, listening. A good plan assumes Dracot behaves like a reasonable officer, pulls back when the cost outweighs the prize. Dracot doesn't behave that way, never did. So what I've got isn't good. What I've got is the plan that costs us least, against a man who doesn't calculate cost the way sensible men do. Tell it anyway, Talsa said. He told it. Every soft place in the mountain's defense, hardened these past 2 months, now arranged into a design meant to bleed an attacking column slow, choke it at the narrow bend. Yepa had once argued didn't need a guard. Funnel whatever survived, that bend into the small gallery, where a dozen rifles, if it came to rifles, could hold a corridor built for exactly this, and nothing else. And beneath it all, unspoken until Talsa asked directly, the truth neither of them wanted to say aloud first. If the outer defense fails, Talsa said, if Dracot's numbers prove too many for the bend to hold, what then? Then we run, Silas said, through the second passage, the one that comes out in the valley east, the one only a handful of you have ever walked end to end. He held her eyes. I know it's not finished being cleared. I know it hasn't been used since before I arrived. But it's the only way out that doesn't put every soul in this mountain in a single killing ground. Talsa was quiet a long moment, and something crossed her face that Silas had not seen there before. Not the flat command of judgment, but the particular weight of a woman about to gamble everything she had built on a passage she herself had not walked in years. Then we clear it, she said. Tonight, however long it takes. She rose from the map table, and for a moment something passed across her face that Silas hadn't seen there before. Not the steady authority she wore into every council session, but something closer to a woman doing some she'd hoped, across 12 careful years, to never need to do. Rourke, she said, at the chamber's door, not quite turning back. Whatever comes tomorrow. I want you to know the council was right to argue for keeping you alive that first night. Whatever else happens, that much I am certain of. She left before he could answer, and Silas stood a long while in the empty chamber afterward, the weight of her words settling into him slow, heavy, impossible to set down again once taken up. They did not sleep that night, none of them, and Silas found himself, near midnight, working alongside Atuha and 3 others in the cramped dark of the second passage, clearing fallen rock by lamplight, hands raw, breath short in air gone thin and close. You didn't have to be here, Itua said, working beside him, her voice low with exhaustion. Talsa would have understood if you'd stayed with the main defense. Wanted to know this ground myself, Silas said. Man leads people through a passage. He'd better have walked every foot of it first, not just heard it described on a map. He hauled another loose stone clear, added it to the growing pile behind them. Besides, figured you could use the extra hands, given how your Aunt Silver bought us rifles instead of shovels. It was meant lightly, and Atuha huffed something close to a laugh, tired and thin but real. She'd have bought shovels. too, Atua said, if she'd thought we'd need them this soon. They worked in silence a while after that, the lamp throwing long shadows across stone that hadn't seen light in years. And somewhere in that silence, Silas found himself thinking, unbidden, of every soft place he'd hardened these past 2 months, and of how none of it, in the end, might matter at all if Dreycott's patience finally ran its full course before dawn. Because that was the thought that kept circling back, no matter how hard he tried to keep his hands moving instead of his mind. 2 months of work, 2 months of trust, earned slow, one honest hour at a time. And all of it hanging now on a single morning's outcome, a coin flip dressed up as a plan dressed up as hope. Until Kessa, working a few feet further down the passage, spoke into the quiet, her voice rough with more than just the dust. I keep thinking, she said, not looking up from her own work, that this is my doing. That if I hadn't gone to Voss, hadn't drawn his trail back and forth across this country until somebody noticed. Don't, Ituha said. Sharp, immediate. Don't do that to yourself. Not tonight. It's true, though, isn't it, Rourke? Kessa finally looked up, meeting his eyes across the lamp's uncertain light. Something raw and unguarded in her expression that Silas hadn't seen from her before. You found the traitor's trail. You told Tulsa plainly what it might cost us. I've had weeks now to sit with that plainness, and it doesn't get any easier to carry. Silas set down the stone in his hands, considered his answer a long moment. Because a careless one here would cost more than a careful one's delay. Truth's never as simple as one thread pulling down the whole garment, he said finally. Dreycott was hunting this country before your trade ever drew his soldiers closer. Might have found us anyway, eventually, trade or no trade. Might not have. No way to know for certain, and dwelling on the might-have beans costs you sleep you need tonight more than any of us. He held her gaze steady. What I know for certain is this. You were trying to keep your people breathing, same as every soul in this passage tonight. Doesn't make the cost lighter, but it does make the trying worth something, Kessa. Worth remembering, whatever comes tomorrow. Kessa held his gaze a long moment, something loosening slightly in her shoulders, and returned to her work without further argument. Though Sassas noticed, the rest of that long night, that she worked a little steadier after that, a little less like a woman, carrying the whole weight of the coming morning alone on her own back. Taki found him near the passage's mouth, close to first light, when the clearing work had finally paused for what little rest anyone could steal before the day ahead. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside him in the dark, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. I keep thinking, she said finally, of everything I have not yet said to you. Say it now then, Silas said quiet. Seems like as good a time as any's ever going to come. Taki was quiet a moment longer, gathering something, and when she spoke, her voice had none of the careful distance she'd kept between them, even in their gentlest exchanges these past weeks. I am glad, she said, that you crawled through that crack in the rock. I have not let myself say that plainly before. I am saying it now because tomorrow may not give either of us the chance again. Taki, let me finish. Her hand found his in the dark, steady despite everything. Whatever happens today, however this ends, I do not regret a single hour of these past 2 months, watching you become something none of us expected a wounded stranger to become. If that is the last true thing I ever say to you, I want it to be that. He turned to face her fully, close now in the dark, and found himself without words, for a long moment, which was rare for him, and rarer still for the particular weight sitting in his chest. Then, let me save mine too, he said finally. I've spent 5 years convinced the best thing I could do for anybody was stay clear of them entirely. Wasn't till I crawled half dead into your world that I understood how wrong that conviction was. He held her hand tighter. Whatever's coming today, Taki, I'm not running from it. Not this time. Not from you, and not from whatever debt Dreycott thinks I still owe him. I'm done running. Have been, I think, since the morning you first found me. She kissed him then, brief, fierce, unhurried despite everything the coming hours promised, and when it ended neither of them spoke again, simply sat together in the thinning dark, hands joined, waiting for whatever dawn would bring. Dawn brought Dracot, not the patient, distant column of the weeks before, but something faster, harder riders pushing their horses up the outer approaches with a purpose that told Silas, watching from the ridge with Yeppa and a dozen armed women beside him, that Dracot's patience had finally, fully run its course. He's found the outer approach, Yeppa said low urgent. Knew he would eventually, Silas said, watching the column's leading edge crest the final ridge, sunlight catching on rifle barrels and brass buttons alike. Question was always when, not if. Get word to Tulsa. It's starting. The word traveled fast. The mountain's whole population moving with the practiced efficiency of a community that had drilled for exactly this morning across 12 long years, non-combatants funneling toward the second passage under Suhala's direction, fighters taking positions. Silas himself had helped design the narrow bend, the false passages, the small gallery built for nothing except this. He took his place beside Nashota at the narrow bend, rifle in hand, the same rifle Tulsa had granted him weeks before with a warning he hadn't forgotten. Didn't expect to be standing shoulder to shoulder with you, Nashota said, checking her own weapon with quick, practiced hands. Didn't expect it either, Silas admitted. Life's got a way of surprising a man, given enough time. If we survive this, Nashota said, not looking at him, I'll admit you were worth the gamble. If we don't, well, won't much matter, what I admitted. Will it? Guess we'd better survive it, then, Silas said, and Nashota's mouth twitched, something close to a real smile, before the first shots rang out below, and there was no more room left for anything except the fight itself. The battle that followed did not resemble anything Silas had known in 8 years of cavalry service, and he understood within the first violent minutes exactly why. Because this was not two armies meeting on open ground, maneuvering, retreating, regrouping at a safe distance. This was a mountain's worth of women defending the only home most of them had ever fully trusted, fighting in corridors too narrow for retreat, too close for anything except the rawest, most immediate kind of courage. Smoke first, then noise, a wall of it, rifle fire cracking off stone until the echoes themselves became a weapon, disorienting, deafening, impossible to place a single shot's true origin inside the chaos. Then the smell, powder and blood, and underneath it all the mineral bite of shattered rock, stone dust hanging thick enough to taste. He fired, reloaded, fired again. Didn't count the shots. Couldn't afford to, not with Nashota shouting orders somewhere to his left, and a soldier's shape lunging out of the smoke close enough that instinct alone, 8 years of instinct, turned the rifle butt into a weapon before conscious thought ever caught up to the movement, which was how it went. In truth, the whole first stretch of that morning. Not thought. Just motion. Just the old, terrible fluency his body had never fully forgotten. However many years he'd spent trying to convince himself he'd walked clear of it for good. The narrow bend held longer than he'd dared hope. Dracot's first wave, pushing hard into the passage, expecting an easy sweep through frightened stragglers, met instead a corridor of trained, disciplined resistance, arrows and rifle fire funneled into a killing ground, built for exactly this purpose, and the wave broke, bloodied, forced back into the daylight beyond. A cheer went up, brief, ragged, exhausted women who had trained for this exact morning across 12 long years, tasting, for one suspended breath, the possibility that the training might actually hold. But Dracot did not stop. Silas had known he wouldn't, and the knowing didn't make watching the second wave come any easier. More riders, more rifles, and this time, worse. A small canton dragged up the outer approach on a makeshift sledge, aimed square at the passage mouth. He saw it before anyone else did. Recognized the shape of it, the particular dread that came with recognizing it. Because a scout who'd ridden 8 years with cavalry knew exactly what that black iron mouth meant for stone corridors built to hold rifles, not artillery. And he recognized something worse in the way the gun crew sighted their angle, not guessing, not sweeping the rock face blind, but aiming with the flat certainty of men working from a mark already scouted. Wagon ruts, most likely. hoofprints worn deep by months of a trader's repeated visits. The same trail Voss had carved back and forth across this ground, trading rifles for silver, now read plain as a signpost by soldiers who knew exactly how to follow one. "Fall back," Silas shouted over the rising din. "Fall back now." Nobody argued. Nobody had time to. The order passed down the line faster than his own voice could have carried it, discipline holding even as the ground itself seemed to hold its breath. And then the cannon fired, and the world became noise and light and falling stone all at once, and Silas had found himself thrown hard against the passage wall, ears ringing, dust choking every breath, unable for several long seconds to tell up from down at all. They fell back in good order, mostly, the discipline of 12 years drilling holding even under fire this heavy, but the cannon's second shot tore through stone that had stood solid for longer than any of them had been alive, tore through it precisely, unerringly, along the exact stretch of outer wall that Voss's wagon had worn thin with 2 years of quiet crossings, and in the chaos and dust and screaming that followed, Silas lost sight of everyone he'd meant to be watching. He found Sansi first, in the smoke-choked gallery beyond the bend, standing over a fallen soldier who had breached the line, her knife bloodied, her whole body shaking with the particular tremor that comes after violence a person never wanted to be capable of. "First time," she said when she saw him, voice raw. "First time I know," Silas said, gripping her shoulder hard, steadying her the way he'd once steadied green recruits on their first hard morning of real fighting. "Breathe. You did what the moment demanded. Nothing more, nothing less. That's all any of us can claim today." Ituha appeared beside them a moment later, dragging a wounded woman clear of the gallery's collapsing edge, her face set in the fierce, focused calm of someone who had found, in the middle of chaos, exactly the kind of courage her aunt's exile had never managed to shake loose of her. "The gallery's not holding," Ituha said, breathless. "We need to fall back further. Now, before." The rest of her sentence was lost beneath a fresh volley of rifle fire, and Silas grabbed both young women by the arm, hauling them bodily toward the passage that led deeper into the mountain, toward the non-combatants, toward whatever chance still remained of getting this family clear before the whole gallery came down around them. He found Tulsa at the main entrance, standing alone against a tide that should have swept her under within seconds, and understood, seeing her there, exactly what she intended to do. "Tulsa, get them to the second passage," she said, not turning from the entrance, rifle steady in her hands, despite the smoke and chaos pressing in around her. "All of them. I'll hold this ground as long as I'm able. That's not a plan. That's a death sentence, and you know it." "It is both," Tulsa said, and finally turned to face him, and in her eyes, Silas saw something he hadn't expected to see there, not fear, not resignation, but a kind of fierce, settled peace, the look of a woman who had spent 12 years preparing for exactly this cost, and had made her peace with paying it long before this particular morning ever arrived, because that was the thing nobody outside this mountain would ever understand about a woman like Tulsa, that a leadership, carried long enough, stopped being a position and became instead a debt, quietly accruing interest. Across every year, a leader kept her people breathing, and debts, eventually, came due. 12 years I have led this family, Rourke," she said. "I do not intend to survive them all, only to watch this place fall because I was too frightened, at the final hour, to stand where standing was needed most. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Tulsa said, cutting him off, gentler now than her voice had been in all the weeks he'd known her. "I have looked for one all night. I looked for one 12 years ago too, the week we wrote the law. Some costs do not have another way around them, Rourke. Only through." She reached out briefly and gripped his shoulder, the first time she had touched him in anything beyond judgment or instruction, and the weight of that small gesture landed harder than the chaos exploding around them. "You brought this family truth when it would have been easier to bring silence," she said. "Twice. Now, remember that, in whatever comes after me. Truth, spoken plain, however much it costs, in the moment it is worth more than any wall I ever built." "Tulsa, go." Her voice cracked like a whip, Command absolute, undeniable. Get them out. That is the only order that matters now. Everything else is already decided. He went. Because there was no arguing with her. Not in that moment. Not with the whole weight of 12 years' leadership, settled final and unshakable, behind her eyes. And because the women pouring past him toward the second passage needed a hand guiding them more than they needed one more voice, arguing a fight already lost. He did not look back, could not afford to. But he heard, even as he ran, the sound of Tulsa's rifle firing steady and unhurried behind him, holding the entrance, buying with every shot the seconds her family needed to escape into the deep dark of the mountain's last, best hope, which was, he understood even then, running blind through smoke and screaming and the particular terror of a collapsing world. The last true gift a leader could give. The people she'd spent had 12 years refusing to fail. The second passage, half cleared, half treacherous, swallowed them one by one into darkness lit only by hastily carried lamps, and Silas counted heads as they passed Ituha, Kessa close behind her, Suhala herding the youngest and oldest ahead of the fighters, Sansi limping but upright, Yepa carrying a wound she hadn't mentioned till the fighting stopped long enough to notice it. Taki was not among them. He turned back before he'd fully decided to, fighting against the tide of bodies pressing toward escape, and found her 20 yards back, dragging a wounded woman clear of a section of ceiling that had begun ominously to shed loose rock in a fine, steady rain. "Taki! Almost clear!" she shouted back, not stopping, hauling the wounded woman's arm across her shoulders with a strength that belied the strained plain on her face. He reached her just as the ceiling gave way properly, a groan of stone that every scout instinct in him recognized instantly as collapse, the same weakened, stretched the cannon had torn into that morning, the same ground Voss's wagon had crossed 100 quiet times before anyone understood what the crossing would eventually cost, and he threw himself forward, catching her and the wounded woman both, driving all three of them clear as a section of passage roof came down behind them in a roar of dust and broken rock. The way back, the way they'd come, the way that led to the rest of the escaping column, was gone, sealed, buried under stone that would take hours, maybe days, to clear even with every hand in the mountain working at it. "We're cut off," Taki said, coughing dust, staring at the collapse with an expression caught between disbelief and dawning, cold understanding. "We're cut off," Silas agreed, "but we're alive." And Tulsa's law held true. Even now the second passage forked twice back there, before the collapse. There's another way through. Longer, rougher, but it's there. If my memory of the map's serving me right, and if it's not, then we'll find out together, Silas said. Same as everything else, since the night I crawled into your world half dead and out of better options. Something that was almost a laugh, thin and disbelieving, escaped Taki despite everything, and together, with the wounded woman between them, they turned deeper into the unlit dark, searching for the second way through. They walked slow, careful, the lamp's small circle of light the only thing standing between them and a darkness that pressed close on every side. The wounded woman Silas learned her name was Dina, gasped out between labored breaths, grew heavier with every step, and twice they stopped to rebind her wound, hands working fast and sure in the unsteady lamplight, while the mountain's distant fighting echoed, muffled and strange, through solid stone above them. "You're certain of the way," Taki said, during the second stop, watching him study the passage, forking ahead into three uncertain directions. "Certain's a strong word," Silas admitted. "I've got a memory of Tulsa's old survey, half finished, half guessed at even by the women who mapped it originally. Best I can offer you is educated, and hope the education holds." "That's not especially comforting." "No," Silas agreed. "Wasn't trying to be comforting. Was trying to be honest, and figured you'd rather have honest, even now." Taki managed something close to a tired smile at that, despite everything, and nodded toward the leftmost fork. "Then let's find out together," she said, echoing his own words back at him, "whether your honest guess holds." It did. Barely, and not without two more false turns that cost them precious minutes. Neither of them could easily spare, But the passage did, eventually, begin sloping upward, air growing fresher, the particular staleness of deep stone giving way to something that smelled, faintly, unmistakably of open sky. They were close. Silas felt it in his chest, before his mind fully caught up to the recognition, some old scout certainty that had never once failed him in 8 years of reading unfamiliar ground, which was exactly when the passage opened, without warning, into the small chamber where Draycott stood waiting. They found Draycott exactly there, not the empty chamber Silas's racing pulse had half hoped for, but Draycott himself, 3 soldiers at his back, having reached the same small chamber from the opposite direction only minutes before. Silas had spent 5 years building the shape of this moment, in his mind, in fever dreams and long, silent nights alike, and none of the versions he'd imagined matched the reality of it. An older man now, gray threading through hair that had been dark 5 years before, lines carved deep around eyes that widened, slow with recognition, which didn't stop his own mind from racing anyway, wild, ungovernable, the way a man's mind will race when the thing he's feared longest finally stands solid in front of him instead of haunting the dark at the edge of memory. Because here it was, the shape he'd run from, the debt he'd told himself some nights might never actually come due. Except it had, standing right here, in a chamber neither of them had any right to be sharing. 5 years and 100 miles collapsed down into a single held breath. Rourke. The name came out of Draycott like something long held and finally released. I wondered, some nights, whether you'd finally died out here alone, the way you deserved to. Wondered the same about you, Silas said, stepping deliberately between Draycott and Taki, rifle steady despite everything screaming inside him, to let 5 years of buried fury finally loose. Guess we were both disappointed. 5 years, Draycott said, ignoring the rifle entirely, eyes fixed on Silas with an intensity that had nothing rational left inside it. 5 years chasing rumors of a deserter who couldn't stomach a soldier's duty. Do you have any idea what that cost me, Rourke? My command questioned. My judgment doubted. All because you decided your conscience mattered more than your orders. My conscience mattered more than murdering unarmed people, Silas said, flat, final. Still does. Always will. Which felt, saying it out loud after 5 years of only ever saying it silently, inside his own skull, in the dark. Alone, it felt like something breaking loose that had been lodged too long in his chest. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't braced for how much simply speaking the plain truth, out loud, to the man who'd demanded he betray it would cost him, or how much it would give back in the same breath. They were harboring raiders, Draycott said, and something in his voice had gone thin, brittle, the sound of a man repeating a justification he'd worn smooth through 5 years of nightly repetition. Every report confirmed it. Every report you wrote, Silas said. After, to cover what happened before. He held Draycott's gaze, unflinching. 5 years of buried grief, finally given voice. There were no raiders in that camp, Colonel. There were old men, women, children too young to run fast enough. You knew it before you gave the order, and you've spent 5 years telling yourself otherwise, because the alternative was living with what you actually did that morning. Taki's hand found the small of his back, briefly, steadying, though whether she meant to steady him or simply needed the contact herself, Silas couldn't say. Didn't matter, really. Either way it helped. The soldiers at Draycott's back had gone very still, and Silas understood, watching their faces in the lamp's uncertain light, that this, the truth spoken plain, in front of men who had not been there 5 years before, men who had followed Draycott into this mountain, trusting his account of ghost women and stolen horses. This was landing somewhere Draycott's fury hadn't accounted for. That's not Draycott started, and for the first time his voice lost its certainty entirely. You don't understand the pressures of command, Rourke. You never did. That's why you failed at it. I understand plenty, Silas said. I understand a man can spend 5 years hunting a ghost of his own conscience and call it duty the whole way. I understand these soldiers behind you rode into this mountain, believing they were hunting raiders and thieves. Same as you told them. Same lie you told yourself 5 years back. He glanced past Draycott, meeting the eyes of the nearest soldier young, uncertain, clearly hearing something in this exchange he hadn't expected to hear. Ask him yourself. Ask Colonel Draycott what became of that village 5 years back, the one he doesn't like to discuss in his official reports. Ask him why the scout who refused that order has spent 5 years running instead of facing a court that would have cleared him, if the truth of that morning had ever been allowed to reach it. You're lying, Draycott said, but the words came out weak, unconvincing even to his own ear by the sound of it. Ask your own men, Silas said. Look at their faces, Draycott. Look at them right now, and tell me they still believe every word you've told them these 5 years. Draycott did not look. Could not, perhaps, bring himself to. Enough, he snarled instead, raising his own weapon. And for a terrible, suspended moment, Silas thought the whole exchange would end in exactly the violence he'd spent 5 years trying to walk clear of. Except the young soldier at Draycott's back spoke first, voice unsteady but clear in the chamber's close quiet. Sir, is it true? What he's saying about the village? Draycott froze, just for a moment. But it was enough for Silas to see, plain on every soldier's face in that lamp chamber, the first real cracks opening in 5 years of carefully constructed certainty. That's not relevant to the mission at hand, Draycott said. But his voice had lost its command entirely, thin now, defensive, in a way that told every man behind him more than any direct confession could have. With respect, sir, the young soldier said, it seems mighty relevant, given we've been chasing a scout you called a deserter and a coward for 5 years, and he's standing here, defending unarmed women, instead of running from us like a guilty man would. The chamber held its breath, Draycott's weapon still raised, his soldiers' loyalty visibly, audibly fracturing around him, and Silas understood that whatever happened in the next few seconds would decide far more than his own survival. Colonel, Silas said, quiet now, all the old fury drained out of his voice, replaced by something closer to genuine, weary sorrow. This ends today, one way or another. You can walk out of this mountain and let it end with the truth finally spoken. Or you can add more blood to a mourning that's already cost this family more than you'll ever fully understand. But either way, Draycott, it ends today. I'm done running from it, and I think, deep down, some part of you is tired of chasing it too. The silence stretched, taut, dangerous, and then, slowly Draycott's weapon lowered, an inch, then another, and something in his face crumpled that had nothing to do with defeat in battle, and everything to do with 5 years of buried truth finally, unavoidably surfacing in front of the men who trusted him. Stand down, he said finally, hoarse, barely audible. All of you. Stand down. They did not press the advantage. Could not. In truth, Silas's rifle was the only weapon among them. Taki unarmed, save for the knife at her belt. The wounded woman between them in no state for further violence, regardless of how the standoff resolved. But Draycott's soldiers, hearing their commander's own broken voice give the order, lowered their weapons without further argument, and something in the chamber's tension, finally, fully released. The passage behind us, Silas said, into the strange, exhausted quiet that followed. Is it clear? Can we reach the surface that way? It's clear, one of the soldiers said, still watching Draycott with an expression that had shifted, permanently, from loyalty into something far more complicated. Leads out near the eastern ridge. We came through it ourselves, not 20 minutes back. Silas looked to Taki, and something passed between them, unspoken but complete the second way through, found after all, though not remotely in the manner either of them had expected. Then we're leaving, Silas said. All of us. Together until we're clear of this mountain, and then your colonel can explain to whatever command still trusts him exactly why a search for ghost women ended with him standing down in a cave in front of witnesses, rather than firing on unarmed civilians. Draycott said nothing, simply stood there, weapon lowered, the whole weight of 5 years buried guilt, finally publicly unburied, and Silas understood watching him that this not violence, not vengeance, but truth spoken plain in front of the men whose trust Draycott had spent 5 years exploiting was a harder reckoning for a man like Draycott than any bullet could have delivered. The walkout took the better part of an hour. single file, through a passage none of them had fully cleared, Dracot silent the whole way, his soldiers casting glances at him that carried none of their old certainty. Silas walked near the rear, Taki and the wounded woman just ahead, watching the colonel's back the whole way, unable, even now, to fully let his guard down around a man who had haunted 5 years of his life without ever once meaning to grant him peace. Near the passage's end, where daylight first began bleeding thin and gray into the dark ahead, Dracot stopped and turned, and for a long moment simply looked at Silas across the narrow space between them. "I won't ask forgiveness," Dracot said, voice rough, stripped now of every trace of the command it had carried an hour before. "Wouldn't insult either of us by asking it. But I want you to know, Rourke, whatever happens to my career, my rank, whatever, this inquiry decides I heard you. Today, truly heard you. For the first time in 5 years of telling myself, I hadn't done what you keep insisting I did. Wasn't insisting," Silas said, quiet. "Was just done letting the silence carry it instead." Dracot held his gaze a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his tired eyes, and then turned and walked on without another word, and Silas let him go, understanding that whatever came next, for Colonel Edmund Dracot, was no longer a debt Silas owed him any further accounting for. They emerged onto the eastern ridge into full daylight, blinking against sun that felt, after the chamber's close dark, almost unbearably bright, and found the rest of the fleeing column already gathered in the valley below. Having found their own way clear through the passage's original unconcept route, Silas counted faces as he descended, breath catching each time, until he found the ones that mattered most. Suhala, exhausted but upright, tending the wounded with quick, sure hands. Ituha and Kessa together, unharmed. Yup, her wound bound now, leaning on Sonsi for support. Relief hit him then, sudden, overwhelming, nearly buckling his knees on the last stretch of the descent, because he'd spent the whole climb down bracing for worse, counting faces, and dreading, with every count, the ones that might not answer Nashota, alive though, her face, when she found Silas, descending the ridge, carried a grief he understood before she spoke it. "Tulsa," she said, and the single word carried the whole weight of everything that had happened at the main entrance, while Silas had been fighting his own reckoning half a mountain away. He knew, had known, really, from the moment he'd left her standing at that entrance, rifle steady, peace settled final behind her eyes. But knowing and hearing confirmed were two different weights entirely, and this one landed harder than he'd braced for. She held the entrance, Nashota said, when Silas said nothing, unable to, long enough for every last soul in this column to reach the second passage. She did not survive it. I do not believe she intended to. Silas closed his eyes a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle into him. 12 years of hard-won leadership ended in a single morning's fire. "She knew what she was choosing," he said finally. "Told me herself, before I left her at that entrance. Said she'd made her peace with the cost a long while back. Doesn't make the cost lighter to carry," Nashota said. And for the first time since he'd known her, her voice cracked just slightly, grief breaking through the hard discipline she'd worn like armor across every conversation they'd ever shared. "No," Silas agreed, quiet. "It doesn't. Don't imagine it ever will." They stood together a long moment in the valley's gathering light. Two people who had started this story as enemies and ended it, somehow, as something closer to family, united now in a grief neither of them had expected to share so completely. "She'd have wanted you to know," Nashota said finally, wiping her face with the back of one hand, brisk, embarrassed by her own tears, in a way that felt, to Silas, achingly human. "The last thing she said to me, before the fighting started proper, she said the gamble on you had already oldie. Whatever came of the morning after, said you'd more than earned whatever trust this family still owed you." Something in Silas's chest broke open at that, quiet, private, and he said nothing for a long while, simply stood there in the morning light, carrying the weight of a debt finally, fully paid. They buried what they could recover of Tulsa 3 days later, once the fighting's aftermath had settled enough to allow for it in A quiet clearing at the valley's northern edge, chosen because it caught the first true light each morning, and because Suhala said, simply, that Tulsa had spent 12 years underground and deserved, now, an eternity spent facing the sun instead. The whole community gathered for it, every last soul who had survived that terrible morning together in a silence that held more weight than any words could have carried. Ahiga spoke first, her old voice, carrying clear across the gathered crowd, telling of the young woman Tulsa had once been, before the grief that built the law, before the 12 years of leadership that had aged her beyond her true years. Nashota spoke after, brief, halting, grief roughening every word, telling of a friendship that had survived disagreement after disagreement precisely because both women had trusted each other to argue honestly rather than simply agree. Silas did not think he would be asked to speak and was surprised. Therefore, when Taki nudged him gently forward, when a dozen faces turned toward him expectant, waiting, he stood a long moment, gathering himself, aware of how strange it was, still, to stand here as anything other than a stranger these people had every right to distrust. I knew her 3 months, he said finally, voice rough. Wasn't long, set against 12 years of history, I'll never fully understand the weight of. But I'll tell you what I do understand. He looked out at the gathered crowd, found Nashota's eyes, found Taki's. She gambled on me the first night I crawled half-dead into her world, when every reasonable argument said she shouldn't have. She kept gambling on me, every week after, right up until the morning. She chose to spend her own life buying the rest of you the seconds you needed to survive. That's not a small thing. That's not a woman who led out of fear, whatever the law she wrote might suggest to a stranger hearing its origin cold. That's a woman who led every single day, choosing hope over certainty, again and again, harder than most people manage even once in a whole lifetime. He paused, throat tight, and found the last of it waiting there, plain and true. I owe her my life twice over, once for not killing me the night the choice would have been easier, and once more for showing me, across 3 short months, exactly what it cost a person to lead with courage instead of simple survival. I won't forget either debt, not for as long as I'm breathing. The silence that followed held, unbroken, for a long moment, and then Nashota stepped forward and set the first stone atop the modest cairn they'd built, and one by one, the whole gathered community followed, until Tulsa's resting place stood marked by 100 small stones, each one carried, and placed by hands that had trusted her, argued with her, and in the end, mourned her completely. It was Suhala who raised the question of leadership, a week later, in a council held once more beneath open sky, though this time the mood carried less argument and more a kind of weary, necessary practicality. This family cannot go leaderless, she said. Whatever shape we choose to take next, mountain or valley, together or divided, someone must carry what Tulsa carried. I will not pretend that burden appeals to me. I have spent my life healing wounds, not commanding armies. All eyes, inevitably, found Nashota, who stood at the circle's edge, arms crossed, her face carrying an expression Silas hadn't seen on her before, not the hard readiness she wore into every fight, but something closer to genuine uncertainty. I am not Tulsa, she said, when the silence had stretched long enough to demand she fill it. I do not have her patience. I have buried too much to trust as easily as she seemed to, even at the end. Nobody is asking you to be her, Itua said, quiet but firm, surprising everyone, including, by the look on her face, herself. We are asking you to be exactly what you already are. The woman who stood at that entrance beside her when she could have run. The woman who spent 12 years making sure this family's hardest decisions were never made lightly. Nashota was quiet a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual sharp edges. I will lead the mountain, she said. Those who choose to return to it. I will not pretend I can lead both halves of this family well, spread thin across a valley and a cave a day's walk apart. But the mountain, her jaw set, resolute. The mountain, I understand. I will not let what Tulsa built crumble simply because she is no longer the one carrying it. The council's approval came without further debate, a quiet, unanimous nodding around the circle, and Silas watched Nashota accept the weight of it with the same grudging, unsentimental grace she'd shown him at the map table, weeks before, not comfortable with the honor, exactly, but unwilling to let the necessary work go undone, simply because it frightened her. "I think you'll lead them well," Silas said to her afterward, as the council dispersed toward its separate fires. "Different than Tulsa. Doesn't mean worse." "We'll see," Nashota said, but something in her face, tired and grieving and resolute all at once, suggested she'd already decided to believe him, whether she said so plainly or not. Word of Dracot reached them a week after that, carried by a rider Suhala trusted enough to send out and back safely. Colonel Edmund Dracot, relieved of his command, pending an inquiry into events dating back 5 years. An inquiry his own soldiers had, apparently, insisted upon once the mountain's dust had settled and the truth had found nowhere left to hide. It was not justice, exactly, and Silas said as much to Taki that evening, sitting at the valley's first common fire, but it was truth, spoken plain, in front of men who might otherwise have gone on believing his lies for years yet to come, and that, Taki told him, was very rarely nothing at all. The community that emerged from that terrible morning was not the community that had entered it. The decision took a full council, the first held in the open air, under true sky, that this family had known 12 years, and it took most of a long, difficult evening. Voices rising and falling around a fire, built large enough to hold every soul who wished to speak. "We built that mountain to survive," Nashota said, standing at the fire's edge, her voice carrying none of its old hardness, only a tired, settled certainty. "It kept us alive 12 years. I do not believe in abandoning what has kept us breathing simply because it cost us grief this one terrible time. And I do not believe," Suhala answered, quiet but unyielding, "in staying hidden forever, simply because hiding has become a habit we have forgotten how to question. We survived the mountain. That does not mean the mountain is the only way left for us to survive." Neither woman argued the other down. That was the thing Silas noticed, watching the debate unfold. No blade drawn, no council seat used as a weapon. Simply two women who had each earned, through blood and years and grief, the right to lead a piece of this family in the direction her own hard-won wisdom pointed. "Perhaps," Ahiga said finally, her old voice cutting through the debate with the particular authority of someone who had outlived every argument currently being made. "Perhaps this family does not need to choose only one direction. We have survived by staying together. We can survive too, by allowing ourselves to grow apart, so long as the growing apart is chosen freely and not driven by fear alone." The vote that followed was not unanimous, and did not need to be. Some chose to return to the mountain. Once the passages were cleared and reinforced, rebuilding deeper, more carefully hidden than before, carrying Tulsa's memory into every stone they set. Nashota led them, in the end a choice that surprised no one, least of all Silas, who had watched her carry the weight of this family's grief and its defense in equal measure across every week he'd known her. Others chose the valley instead, the open sky, the daylight uninterrupted, a life built differently than the 112 years of hiding had demanded. Suhala led that half, practical as ever, already sketching plans for a proper healing house before the first winter frost arrived. Ituha and Kessa stayed together, the old rift between them healed, if not fully forgotten, by everything the mountain's fall had cost and taught in equal measure. Sonsi and Yepa split between the two, sisters choosing separate paths for the first time in their lives and finding, to their own mutual surprise, that the separation cost them less than either had feared, and Sus died in the valley. With Taki, a choice neither of them announced formally, they simply woke one morning, already having made it. The valley changed shape that autumn, week by week. Timber frames rose where there had been only open grass. A proper well was dug, deep and true, under Yepa's careful direction, and the day it first struck clean water, the whole valley gathered to watch, cheering in a way that carried nothing but plain, uncomplicated joy. He found Ituha and Kessa together most after afternoons at the frame of what would become the healing house Hala had promised herself before the first frost, working side by side with an easiness that hadn't existed between them, weeks before a wound clearly still healing. But healing honestly. I think Tulsa would have been glad to see this, Silas said to them once, setting down a load of timber. Whatever else that morning cost us. I think so too, Kessa said finally, something complicated moving across her face. Strange, isn't it? How much of what we built since costs less than what we spent all those years protecting so carefully? Not strange, Silas said. Just honest. Same as everything else worth building, in my experience. He worked most days at whatever needed doing, hands blistered and sun-browned in a way they hadn't been in years, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he didn't miss the solitude he'd once mistaken for peace. This was different. This was work that mattered to more than just his own survival purpose, plain and simple, the kind that didn't ask a man to prove himself constantly, only to keep showing up, honestly, day after day, and let the showing up speak for itself. There was a grief in it too, though, that no amount of new beginning fully erased. Tulsa's absence sat differently than any other grief he carried, not sharp, but steady, settled in alongside him the way a mountain range settles into the horizon, until a traveler forgets it was ever any other shape. Suhala found him with it plain on his face one such dawn, and sat beside him a long while before speaking. "You are grieving a woman who spent the better part of 2 months threatening to kill you," she observed, not unkindly. "Man can grieve complicated things," Silas said. "Doesn't require the thing grieved to be simple." "No," Suhala agreed. "It rarely does. She would not want you carrying it silent, Rourke. She was never a woman who valued silence over honest reckoning, and you proved that yourself, more than once, in the 2 months you knew her." They sat together watching the dawn fully arrive, and Silas found, turning her words over, that something in his chest had loosened, fractionally, for the first time since the fighting had ended. The evening came, weeks into the valley's new life, when Silas finally did the thing he'd been carrying the want to do since the morning Dracot's weapon had lowered in that lamp-lit chamber. He walked to the fire's edge, alone, carrying the old cavalry rifle Tulsa had granted him what felt now like a lifetime ago, and set it down deliberately in the dirt beside the flames. Not thrown, not discarded in anger, simply set down, the way a man sets down a weight he's finally, fully done carrying. Taki watched him do it from across the fire, and said nothing, understanding, Silas thought, exactly what the gesture meant without needing it explained. He sat beside her afterward, the fire warm against the valley's cooling autumn air, and looked out at the gathered lights of a community, rebuilding itself from grief into something new. Smaller fires scattered across the valley floor, voices carrying low and easy on the evening wind, laughter, real and unguarded, rising now and then, above the general murmur. He thought, sitting there, of the man he'd been a season ago, 34 years old and moving like a man twice that, sleeping 40 yards from his own fire back to stone, certain the rest of his life would look exactly like the 5 years behind it, small, silent, unwitnessed. That man felt, now, like someone he'd once known briefly and lost track of, a stranger glimpsed once on a road that no longer led anywhere Silas recognized. Ahiga's voice rose somewhere nearby, beginning another story. This one already carrying, Silas caught in fragments, the shape of what had happened at the mountain, Tulsa's stand at the entrance, the reckoning in the collapsed passage, the long walk down into a valley that would, in time, become its own kind of home. He heard his own name woven somewhere into the telling, unassuming, one thread among many, and found he did not mind it, did not need the story to make more of him than the truth had actually made. He understood, sitting there, that his own part in that story was already being folded into something larger than himself, not the hero of it, not even close, simply one thread among 100 others, woven into a history that would outlast every person currently gathered around these scattered fires. The wind moved through the valley then, low and steady, the same wind that had once seemed to him, a season ago, a thing that forgave nothing, a thing a man endured, rather than lived alongside. He felt it differently now, sitting here with Taki's hand, in his not an enemy to be outlasted, but simply weather, moving through a life that had, against every reasonable expectation, finally stopped being something to merely survive. Taki's hand found his in the firelight, and he held it, and neither of them spoke, because some things he'd finally learned across this long, transformative season didn't need speaking to be entirely, unshakably understood. She looked at him. He looked back, and somewhere beyond the fire's warm light, the valley settled into its first true night of peace in longer than anyone gathered there could easily remember. The past finally, truly behind them, and whatever came next, waiting, patient and unhurried, for morning.